We are live.
Welcome to the 13th Annual Education for Activists Conference. 2 sessions of education, discussion, and debate about today's key issues and the political alternatives facing humanity. The theme is Revolution or Ruin. My name is Elizabeth Bice. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and past Secretary of York Region, Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on the unceded territories of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Haudenosaunee people. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Bill Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. We call this gathering an Education for Activists Conference. Why? Because more people today are becoming activists, looking for social answers to the problems we face that comes from a toxic global system in steep decline. Many are turning to revolutionary Marxism for a scientific explanation of the ills of capitalism. Moreover, they want to know what to do about it. They are looking for effective action. This weekend, we will examine history, economics, ecology, and political strategy. You will hear proposals for a concrete program for action. Socialist Action is proudly part of the working class. Workers are the vast majority of society, over 80% of the total. But if the problem was just a matter of outnumbering the super rich, 1% minority, the working class would have solved the problem a long time ago with a simple vote. Unfortunately, there is a huge apparatus of control that keeps the tiny capitalist class in power. Divide and rule is their method. The challenge facing the working class is to unite across the lines of oppression, whether the basis of that oppression is race, gender, sexual orientation, language, or nationality. We need to unite, but to do so in an effective way. We need to develop and implement the program and strategy required for working class victory by critically assessing political issues, past and present. As we will do at this conference, we can find the way forward. Revolution or ruin, the change we need, and how to get it. Clearly, these are big questions. We hope they will be addressed to your satisfaction. We invite your participation in the discussion via the chat column so that we can learn from one another. We are approaching the 27th year since the founding of Socialist Action. SA is a revolutionary socialist organization of workers and students, women and men, youth and veterans of the class struggle. We are pleased to welcome here activists from British Columbia, from Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, from all across Southern Ontario, and speakers from the USA and Greece. Workers from a number of unions, from feminist and anti-poverty coalitions, from the NDP, student organizations, and social protest movements are joining this event. Our aim as socialists is to put knowledge to work for fundamental change. We strive to build a mass revolutionary workers' party that will play a decisive role in ending capitalist minority rule. We seek to create a socialist democracy based on majority rule. We invite you to join Socialist Action. Separately, we cannot win. Only together we can achieve the goal of liberation. We hope this conference will convince you to unite with like-minded people to create a better world. And if you decide to join SA during the conference, please sign up at SA website, www.socialistaction.ca. We will warmly welcome you. So, are you ready for a rock and revolutionary time? Ready for education for activists? So let's get started. We begin today with the change we need. We are pleased to have as our speakers, who will speak up to 15 minutes each, Kathy McDonald, Bryn Smith, Tamara Lorincz, and Kostas Skordoulis. The session will open with Emily Sears singing in Spanish, The Right to Live in Peace. She is a music graduate of Wilfrid Laurier University, where she helped to organize a union of teaching assistants under the umbrella of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Emily is a leading member of Socialist Action. So, Emily, please.
Hello, comrades. This song is El Derecho de Vivir en Paz, which I first heard about a year ago during the massive upswelling of Chilean protests and the subsequent curfews and lockdowns and systemic brutality that those people experienced. The soprano Aileen Jovita Romero, sang from her balcony into the curfewed and silent streets, and the streets below erupted into cheers and singing along with this anthem of liberation. The song means the right to live in peace and was written by Victor Jara in the 1970s during the Vietnam War. El derecho de vivir, poeta chivin, que golpea de Vietnam a toda la humanidad. Ningún cañón borrará el surco tu arrasar. El derecho de vivir en paz. Indochina es el lugar más allá del ancho mar, donde revientan la flor con genocidio y napalm. La luna es una explosión que funde todo el amor, el derecho de vivir en paz. Tío, nuestra canción es fuego de por amor, es palomo, palomar, olivo de olivar, es el canto universal, cadena que hará triunfar el derecho de vivir en paz.
Thank you, Comrade Emily. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, our first speaker will be Kathy McDonald. She is an elected trustee on the Peel District School Board, representing Wards 3 and 4 in Brampton, Ontario. Kathy McDonald has been actively involved as a parent volunteer since 2001, elected as trustee in 2014 and again in 2018. Kathy's priorities are to help each child realize their full potential, to support student success through increased funding, to improve student success in math, and to obtain more teaching assistants for students with special education needs. As school council chair at Agnes Taylor Public School and Sir William Gage Middle School, Kathy led parents to become more involved in their children's education. Kathy is a coordinator for a community youth steel band, a children's storyteller of Jamaican folk tales, a member of the Congress of Black Women Brampton chapter, and was previously chair of the Caribbean Pavilion for Caribram, Brampton's multicultural festival. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here to share my journey in dismantling anti-Black racism at the Peel District School Board. So as mentioned, I am a storyteller. So I'm actually going to be telling you a story for you to get a better understanding of this journey as a Black woman, as a wife, as a mother, and as an educational advocate. And I would like to go back to the very beginning of when I first came to Canada. I was about 6 months old when I arrived in Canada. And as you can tell by my non-Canadian accent, that something happened. So we were living in northern Quebec, and my mother got really frustrated of total strangers coming to us to rub our skin and pull up at our hair, and they would just literally circle our house when we play in the backyard, as if to say it was entertainment, just watching us play. And 2 years to the day, she told my dad she'd had enough and she was going back to Jamaica with her children. And my dad came back with my mother, and I actually grew up in Jamaica. So imagine growing up in Jamaica, where you're a Black country, predominantly Black country, surrounded by Black excellence. So having people like Jean Augustine, a member of parliament in the Prime Minister's cabinet, is not a novelty. Having Colleen Russell Rawlins leading a educational system is not a novelty. Afua Cooper, Zanana Akande, and it goes on. Leslie Weeks, running for leadership of a political party. You have Laura May Lindo, a representative of a political party. Marcy Ian. These are not novelties growing up. So in Jamaica, we were surrounded by Black excellence and always encouraged as children to dream big, to basically, work hard. Positions of being a judge or a Supreme Court judge wasn't reserved for people with a certain skin tone. It was instilled in us the value of education. And growing up, I never had any doubt in my ability to achieve or be anything I wanted to be. And sadly, on coming to Canada, because I came to Canada to go to McGill University, where I did my first degree there. And, what struck me is the international students all had very positive educational experiences. They were never told they were less than. They were never told they don't belong in university, or they could never be in university. Whereas for Canadian children, or I should say students, because we're in university, their experience were totally different. Every single person that I met at McGill and at Concordia, because I had a lot of friends at Concordia, who were at university, had been told many times throughout their educational journey that they should not be there. And I found that quite shocking and stunning. And also being married, at the time, actually, I was dating a young man who's now my husband. And he came to Canada when he's 13 years old. He's a Trinidadian. He has a very kind of singy-songy accent, right? And so they put him in a special class simply because he sounded different than the mainstream population, right? And if it wasn't for Trinidadian vice principal that rescued him, he would never have been in the university stream courses, because the gentleman, God rest his soul, Ken Tanis, looked at him and said, "What are you doing in this class? You don't belong here," and had put him in a correct stream that he was supposed to be. And, people, when you hear stories like that, people think like, racism only happens in the US. And I tell people, I actually prefer the racism in the US, because at least you know where you stand with people. In Canada, we have this very polite racism, right? And it's like, we don't have racism in Canada, which is absolutely false, right? And I think it's actually more insidious, more dangerous, because people pretend as if to say we are just all kumbaya in Canada, and tend to ignore and dismiss serious systemic issues that we have in Canada. So early on in my career, when I came here, I realized that I had to, I couldn't work. I was lucky I had my husband's job afforded me that luxury, because I had nobody in this country that I could count on, to be there for my kids if I had an issue. Because at the time, my husband worked downtown Toronto. I worked in Guelph and I lived in Brampton. So both of us worked, for people who are not familiar with the cities, about an hour away from where we lived, an hour away from our jobs. And my husband and I lived in opposite directions. So if you have children in school and there's an issue of getting to your child. And, I got very involved because I was very intrigued in the educational system here, because it was very different from what I was used to in Jamaica. So when I remember, before I actually entered the system, I was watching TV one day with my son, and he said to me, "Mom, why are Black people bad? Why are Black people bad?" And I said, "Are you bad?" He says, "No, but because of the images he was getting on, for example, his cable TV at the time, because he didn't go to daycare, right? He just saw all these images of this negativity, how we were portrayed in the media. So the very next day I've cut my cable TV, and to this day I've never had cable, because why am I putting money, paying, and mainly white people to make money, right, on the lies and how they portray Black people, predominantly in this negative light, right, in the news. And I always say, I sit and I would watch news or newspaper articles. And when they, for example, they're making a big drug bust and they're taking out the drug lords in, let's say, Woodbridge, right? You say you don't see pictures of the people living behind there, but they're not Black people in those big 5-car garage mansions. But when they're catching a little guy in the corner selling some drugs and it's a Black individual, you can see the pores on his face how large these pictures are. And we'd have discussions about that. And, I was sick and tired of the negative stereotypes. And I wanted to ensure that my energy was focused into raising bright, driven, responsible, compassionate, and kind children. And I had to battle the everyday in the children's school, the trauma of getting an education. And make no mistake about it, racism is very traumatic. It is weary and it drains on the mental health of our children. So, I have 4 children, as I said, and I look at the experiences of my 4 children when they were in the public education system. And I look at my 22-year-old, for example, he's now 22. When he was in school, he had a teacher tell him that he's supposed to be a criminal, right? You have a kid who gets perfect in an international math exam, an exam that almost 40,000 children take. And he was not even told that the fact that he got perfect in this exam because they thought he wouldn't care. And that's despite coming from a 2-parent household. We're both postgraduate university educated. I mean, we're not the Obamas, but, we are just regular Black folks trying to raise our children to be decent human beings. And they thought we wouldn't care, it wouldn't matter. And I looked at our situation and I said, I couldn't imagine how they're judging someone like my son. What happens to parents that have struggles or trials, just trying to make ends meet, right? I was always present in the school. What happened to a mom that can't be present in a school all the time? How does that mom get labeled? And you hear people, they have like these model minorities, and somehow Black students, we don't fit into that category, right? So we are less than, and we're treated as inferior. To have teachers, and sometimes immigrant teachers who come to this country, they ascribe to the same colonial mentality that we're somehow inferior. So when you go into a gifted program, you'd hear things like, "Oh, I didn't know Black students were smart." So it's shocking that Black people are actually smart and can get into a gifted program. You have comments where people are saying, "Oh, Black people are not responsible, we're lazy." So I guess every other race, every person in that race are just responsible people. They're not lazy, but you only find lazy people, I guess, in the Black race, right? And these are the messages that I couldn't understand. And I remember my 4-year-old going into kindergarten, and she had a friend of hers who was from a different country, wasn't born in Canada, and said to her, "Oh, I can't play with you because my mom says Black people are bad." And these are what our Black children were faced with every day, and an educational system that was doing nothing to address any of these issues. So I decided to run for trustee. It's an elected position, and I wanted to address, one, the inequities in special education. And also I noticed outside of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, kids in poverty were also treated very poorly. Because I have been told, when at school councils or speaking with principals, advocating for kids in poverty, and poverty knows no color, right? So doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about Black people here, because I like to remind people in Brampton, according to the 2016 census, majority of Black people owned our own home. We owned our own homes. So we're taxpayers. 90% of Black families in Brampton back then owned their own home. I don't know what the stats are now. However, we're treated as if to say we're asking a favor. We're legally entitled to an education. We're taxpayers. And even if we're welfare, we're legally entitled to an education. We look at how kids in poverty, look at addressing anti-Black racism. And when, as an elected board of trustees, charged with governance of this education system in the Peel District School Board and overseeing policies, it was shocking to me that how blatantly racist people were when policies were put forward, or people were questions about lack of policies, lack of accountability for our Black children in education. So for me, though, I saw it as a challenge. It fueled my passion. I remember when I started, an individual told me that I will be standing by myself, making all this noise, and the community will tire. And I looked at them and I said, you don't know me and you don't know my community. And I always emphasize the importance of the community and people power, because I may have been, the person that exposed or was vocal about it at the board table. However, by myself, I would not have been able to achieve what I did without the community coming meeting after meeting, demanding change and no longer just accepting status quo. And you see, I think we had a perfect mix, because in the past, they were used to, our parents who came, like people came in the 70s and 60s, and they sort of, you didn't want to rock the boat. You just wanted to try and be this model citizen. And how quickly your children realized it didn't matter how model citizen you were always and would be a second-class citizen in Canada if something didn't change. And I think you had parents like myself who, well, I personally didn't, but like my husband, who went through the education system here and who refused to settle for and let their children go through what they did. Because you see, in Canada, we have a history of studying and releasing these reports, a lot of pretty glossy, sheeny posters, and nothing gets done. And there are big unveilings. And at the end of the day, because my husband was in school over 40 years ago, right? And the same things that was happening to him was happening to his children, right? You look at the Stephen Lewis report. That report is almost 30 years old. It's about 27, almost 30 years old. You have the FACES report in 2015. And I say that Black people, we are the most studied species on the planet, but nothing comes from anything they learn from these studies, right? So as a new trustee, and in 2015, when the FACES, early 2015, when the FACES report was released, I realized that was like the gasoline to the spark in me. And I said, we have concrete data and modern, here it is right now in the moment. But again, we were told by the board that this doesn't refer to Peel. This is to the Peel District School Board. This is about Peel region. So again, we had to do another study to study our Peel students. And surprise, surprise, it told us the exact same thing. And that still didn't move them. It's the classic anti-Black racism strategy. It is stop, stall, and start again. And I was determined. I said, you know what? I know that I have 4 years as an elected official, right? So I don't plan. I'm not working to say I want to be here 20 years down the road. I know I have these 4 years term mandate. So I'm going to work as if this is my only time to achieve what I need to achieve. And that's what I did. And, I said we are going to make sure that this, my children or future Black children, they don't have to go through the same things that I am going through, or that I should say their dad went through, right? So I look at people, like at the time we had 2 trustees that supported me, because as a trustee, I have no individual power. Everything comes to a vote, and I need someone to be able to put my motions on the table. So luckily I had Trustee Harkirat Singh and Noka the Crew, who were with me, but we're on a board of 12. We still couldn't really get what we needed done on our own. So that's how important the
30 seconds.
Okay, so we reached out to politicians to help us. Sorry, it was 15 minutes, you said? I have 10 minutes. Okay.
We're taking the time.
Okay. So basically, you make sure you, in terms of making change, reach out to politicians that have the political will. We were fortunate that our Minister of Education, when the community came in an uproar, I remember after one meeting, I literally drove around Toronto till I found our Minister of Education, Minister Leche, and he was open to listen to us. So he ordered a review, which led to an investigation. It unveiled so many inequities in our system. We have like regional learning choices where we have less than 10 Black students in the whole board, over 156,000 students represented. And people were okay with that. Well, I was not okay with that, because unless you think that Black people are somehow intellectually inferior, then you could not be okay with these statistics, right? So this journey thus far has been very lonely. It has been dehumanizing, draining, and consuming. But you know, I see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have now we're under supervision. We have 2 amazing leaders, our supervisor, Bruce Rodriguez, and our new director, Colleen Russell-Rawlings, have been making astounding changes to the education system. And, you know, there's a proverb, an African proverb that says, until lions get their own historians, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And I think what you're seeing now are lions roaring. And it is so important to realize that it takes a community effort. If somebody told me 6 years ago that police would be out of our schools, I would thought it would have been impossible. But my last motion before supervision was to dismantle what they call the SRO programs, to get police out of our schools. When I went to Jamaica, we didn't have police in our schools. You look at private schools, you know, in Upper Canada College, they don't have police in their schools. So why is it in public education that we want children under police supervision 24/7? They're not criminals. And when you look at admissions, that has happened to our children, it is important to know that we can't sit silently by and allow this to happen. So I'll stop there, and I'll answer any questions that you have at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And I'm sorry that I had to interrupt you, but we have a long session and in a small window of time. Mm-hmm. Okay. Our next speaker is Kostas Skordoulis. He's a member of OKDE, the section of the 4th International in Greece. He taught for years in Britain, and he is a professor of philosophy at the University of Athens. He is the editor of the interdisciplinary journal, KRITIKI, Critical Science and Education. He is the secretary of the Teaching Commission of the Division of History of Science and Technology of the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science. Welcome, Kostas.
So, good evening to all. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel. I will focus my intervention mainly on the pandemic, which is the main problem Europe faces this time. And also I will talk about the consequences of the pandemic. So we live through an pandemic according to the specialists, which is of enormous human cost, especially for the working class. This is the fault of the governments, which have been managing the crisis of the pandemic for more than 9 months, with the sole criterion of reducing the financial losses for big business, the big capital, and providing no social care whatsoever for the poor people. The governments the capitalist governments do not hesitate to say that the lockdown, that means the restriction of movement for the population, is done so that the national health systems and especially the intensive care units can sustain the human load. And also, they say that they are preparing the market to be open for Christmas. Private clinics at the same time are getting richer, while public hospitals are on the verge for collapse. In this lockdown, there is a hypocrisy. Government officials are targeting anyone who may have gone for a walk after 9 a.m., and at the same time, they leave factories and workplaces untouched. Mass production is going on as normal. Mass transport is carrying people to work, so not to disrupt capitalist profits. We envisage that next year there will be a deep recession for the capitalist economy, a recession much bigger than that of the first years of the 2008 crisis, which was not solved by the few years of anemic recovery in the mid of 2010. But if the apparent cause of the recession is the pandemic of coronavirus, the underlying cause is much deeper. It is the long crisis of capitalism, the constant decline of the average rate of profit. We know from history that capitalism solves its historical crisis with enormous disasters. Such a process of destruction is being carried out by the pandemic today. This catastrophe, however, mainly burdens the working class and the lower social strata. It is certain, therefore, that in the near future, the struggles, mobilizations, and uprisings will be on the rise. All governments know that. That is why the governments are taking care to fortify themselves against the working class and the social movements from today with authoritarian repressive measures, banning marches in Greece, or with passing repressive laws in France. And in Greece, it was very obvious what has happened with an effort to cancel the celebration of and the commemoration of the uprising in the Polytechnic School against the dictatorship. But we are sure that the working class knows how to protect itself, because it knows that the government and the governments whatsoever are not going to do anything about it. The pandemic is also bringing a change in the working relations. Ernest Mandel in Late Capitalism states in his study that capitalism attempts to reverse the long waves of recession with technological revolutions. Such a technological revolution is the digital revolution, which began in 1948 with the discovery of the solid-state transistor, which signified the introduction of automation in the economy, transforming it in the long run into a digital economy. The introduction of automation in economy had the ultimate goal of shortening the production time for goods, commodities, and the production of means of production. The introduction of automation, which started in the late 40s, is accelerated now by the pandemic. Digital labor, distance work, is about to become a rule. And this brings severe changes in the workplaces. This is how we have to see this change in order to understand the change in the working relations and in the organization of the working class. At the same time, digital teaching becomes also something normal at schools. Distance learning also can be seen in this context. And changes in the workplaces follow also changes in education and the ways of learning. And this is also well understood because university and education can be seen as an integral part of the social division of labor. In the late stage of capitalism, university and education as such are pack and parcel in a process of proletarianization of intellectual labor. The conditions at the university resemble the conditions in the factory. At the same time, we have to see also another cultural phenomenon, which also is characteristic of the pandemic. And this is the rise of the conspiracy theories, of theories that aim into introducing social irrationalism, which is a precondition for social conservatism. We'll see that all those denying the reality of the pandemic and the reality of this disaster are the politicians of the alt-right, like Trump and like Bolsonaro in Brazil. At the same time, we have to see the competition between or among the pharmaceutical companies in a race to produce vaccination, the vaccine against coronavirus. We don't have to be deceived that what happened that these companies are working for the health of the people and to save the people from the pandemic. These companies are in the stock exchange, are part of the stock exchange. They trade their stocks, and all this enterprise among them is to increase their profits. So, in conclusion, working people have nothing to expect in this time of crisis from the capitalist governments, from the capitalist companies, or from big capital. The recession which is going to come is going to hit the working class mainly, and it's going to hit the working class worldwide. And this is how we envisage that in the next phase of working class uprisings, we have to be well organized, we have to be well prepared in order to coordinate internationally, because as the pandemic is spread internationally, the reaction of the working class has to be international. And this is, I mean, my participation in this panel signifies this international flavor and international perspective that we want to give in our struggle, which is going to be in the rise in the next phase. Thank you all for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Kostas. Our next speaker is Tamara Lorincz. She is a PhD candidate in global governance at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has a master's in international politics and security studies from the University of Bradford and a law degree, an MBA specializing in environmental law and management from Dalhousie University. She's a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Tamara is also on the advisory committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, World Beyond War, and the No to NATO Network. Welcome, Tamara.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you very much to the organizers. I love the title of this conference, Revolution or Ruin. This is exactly what we're facing. I need to say at the outset that about 3 weeks ago, I was running on this trail and I tripped and fell on my face. That's why I look the way that I do. But I'm speaking to you today from Waterloo. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. I'm doing my PhD at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I'm focusing my doctoral research on the climate impacts of militarism and military exemptions in global climate governance. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the problem that we're all facing, the problem of militarism, and I'm going to focus on military spending, our membership in NATO, and I'm going to talk briefly about Canada's so-called feminist foreign policy. And I want to emphasize that it's militarism that made us ill-prepared to deal with this pandemic, and it's militarism that's making us unable to deal with the climate and ecological breakdown and to deal with the poverty crisis around the world. I'm going to share my slides with you, so I'm just going to get them up right now. Can everybody see my slides okay?
Yes, we can see it, or we did.
Can you see them now all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, I can.
That's great. So this weekend, the Canadian government is hosting the Halifax International Security Forum. This started under the conservative government by Peter MacKay in 2009, and it's a conference that brings together conservative, pro-military, pro-NATO defense officials and politicians and policy analysts around the world. But peace activists in Nova Scotia, yesterday, they organized a counter forum that I spoke at. And today, as we are meeting online, peace activists in Halifax, Nova Scotia are protesting outside the Westin Hotel, outside the Halifax International Security Forum, which has both a virtual and an online presence. Now, I filed an access to information request And to find out more information about how much the Canadian government spends to host this conference. And Canada spends every year about $3.2 million to wine and dine militarists. And at this conference, Canada also gives out something called the John McCain Leadership Award. Now, let's remember that McCain was a Republican senator. He was a hawk that supported every single U.S. military intervention in the post-Cold War period. And while he was running for president, he joked about bombing Iran. Now, this is the person that we are memorializing and giving award in his name. I want to just show you a little bit of the Halifax International Security Forum agenda to give you a sense of what's taking place this weekend. So they have sessions entitled From Moscow to Minsk, Putin's Poison, Maduro's Venezuela, a rogue gallery, Himalayan heat, Sino-India friction. They have a whole document called the China Handbook where they're targeting China. They also have a session on Israel's new friends. And if you look at the panelists and the attendees of this conference, you will see that they have people coming like Tzipi Livni, the hawkish former foreign affairs minister for Israel, the U.S. former CIA director, Leon Panetta, and one of the biggest proponents of NATO, two of the biggest proponents of NATO in the U.S. Congress, Jean Sheehan and Kay Hutchinson. The Halifax International Security Forum is very much a NATO conference. Every year, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, who is always a U.S. general, attends and speaks at the conference. And on Sunday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg will be speaking. And one of the things that he's going to be talking about is a new initiative by NATO that was launched in June of this year, and it's called NATO 2030. And it's an extremely dangerous and provocative expansion plan. It's trying to get NATO to move farther afield geographically and politically. So they want to have a greater NATO presence in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. We absolutely must resist this. This is a plan to militarize the world. You should also know that NATO, which is a military alliance of only 30 countries, is nuclear armed. It's dominated and dictated by the United States, and NATO undermines and circumvents the United Nations. Now, I'd like to speak briefly about the Biden presidency and NATO. And we know from Biden's record that he's a big proponent of NATO. Last year, Biden gave two major addresses on foreign policy, one last February at the Munich Security Conference, and in July at a conference at CUNY in New York, a conference in New York, and in both of those major foreign policy addresses, Biden said that NATO was central to U.S. security policy and security posture. He also said in those speeches that there is strong bipartisan support for NATO. He said that there are two things that Democrats and Republicans support. One is the fight against cancer, and two is support for NATO. He also said that it was under the Obama and Biden administration that military spending started to increase among NATO members. And he was lauding the fact that NATO members are increasing the military spending, and that this hadn't started under the Trump administration. You might think that this might be moderated because of Kamala Harris being the vice president. the vice president. But I want you to be aware that in July of this year, Senator Kamala Harris voted no to an amendment that was brought forward by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren to the Senate. It was an amendment on the National Defense Authorization Act to cut U.S. military spending by 10%, instead to invest in healthcare, education, and housing in the most impoverished communities in the United States, and she voted no. So we can expect under a Biden-Harris administration that there will be strong support for NATO, there will be more NATO interventions, and there will be increase to military spending. Now I'd like to talk to you about Canadian military spending, and I prepared this chart based on the data from the Public Accounts of Canada, and you can compare and contrast federal spending on the Department of National Defense versus the Department of Environment and Climate Change over the past 20 years. So the red line shows you this massive increase to military spending. Last year in Canada, the Canadian government spent $31 billion on the military, but only 1.9 on the Department of Environment and Climate Change. Now, at this level of military spending, we're at 1.3% we're spending 1.3% of GDP on the military. Now, in 2014, all NATO members, including Canada, made a commitment to spend 2% of GDP on the military by 2024. So over the next few years, military spending is going to go even higher. But spending for the environment is so little. Now, at this level of military spending, Canada is ranked 14th highest in the world, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. You can see the chart in front of you. It shows $22 billion. That's US dollars. If you convert it into Canadian, it's about $31 billion. We're just over Israel for military spending, and you can see the top military spenders, of course, are the United States, but China is far below, in second at only $261 billion, and Russia is spending only $65 billion a year for military spending. But constantly, NATO and Canada, claims that China and Russia are the enemies. Now, it's going to get even worse in this country, I'm afraid, because in 2017, the Liberal government announced their defense policy called Strong, Secure, and Engage. We're going to be spending $553 billion on the military over the next 20 years to maintain high-end warfighting. And there was not any dissent from any politician or political party against this defense policy. Now, what does Canada defense policy mean? Well, it's actually our foreign policy. We don't have a written foreign policy. All we have is our defense policy. It's very much motivated by our membership in NATO and our close defense relationship with the United States. We are going to be building more warships than the Harper Conservatives wanted. The Liberals are going to buy more fighter jets than the Harper Conservatives wanted. We're going to be buying new armed drones and attack helicopters. We're going to recruit more soldiers and special forces, and we're going to militarize education. We are spending a lot of money and a lot of fuel for militarism in this country. 4 months after the defense policy came out, the government of Canada released its very first defense and environment strategy. And in that strategy, it acknowledged that Canada, the Canadian military is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in this country. It also stated in this document that emissions from all military activities, operations, and vehicles are exempted from the national greenhouse gas reduction target. It will be impossible for Canada to achieve its Paris Agreement targets to decarbonize by 2030 if we continue to invest in fighter jets, frigates, and tanks that are extremely energy inefficient. Now, there is a misperception in Canada that with all of this military, all of this funding, all of this fuel, that Canada is a force for good in the world. What the Canadian military is doing in the world is peacekeeping. This is not true. These are the latest statistics from the UN Peacekeeping Office, and you can see Canada is ranked 76th. In the world for peacekeeping. This is the lowest level of peacekeeping in Canadian history. We have a mere 38 soldiers that are on UN peacekeeping missions. And if you look at the arrow at the below, you can see the United States, the most well-funded military on the planet, has 28 soldiers doing UN peacekeeping. What Canada and the United States are doing is war making and war fighting. So right now, Canada is leading a NATO battle group in Latvia. We have fighter jets in Romania. We have warships in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea, right on Russia's borders. For 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, Canada was bombing Syria and Iraq. Canada was engaged in a 12-year combat mission in Afghanistan. Canada bombed Libya, and we're arming, of course, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. And of course, Canada overthrew the government of Haiti in 2004, and we are partnering now with the Lima Group to overthrow the government of Venezuela. And it is because of our membership in NATO that Canada is refusing to join the new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Now, Canada's former ambassador to Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria said that the greatest threat to world peace is NATO. I would also add that NATO is one of the greatest enemies to the climate crisis. So the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace has developed a campaign to build national resistance to NATO in this country. Our campaign is Women Say No to NATO, Feminists Against Militarism. Last year, we protested outside the NATO Association of Canada office every single month. We are hoping that we can work with other groups to build this national resistance to NATO. Two things that I would like to bring to your attention is just 2 more slides. There is something called the Canada-NATO Parliamentary Association, and we want this committee to end. There are two NDP members, Jack Harris and Heather McPherson, on this committee. We want to peel them away from this committee, and we want the Green Party and the NDP to take a position for Canada out of NATO and for NATO to be dismantled. And so we're hoping that we can work with allies across the country to delegitimize NATO and to change the narrative on NATO. Now, finally, in conclusion, I just want to bring quickly to your attention that last month, Global Affairs Canada released consultations on a new feminist foreign policy. I don't have time to explain why this is Orwellian, but the very least what we can do is make a submission to say how important it is that Canada demilitarize our foreign policy, how we get serious about disarmament, get out of NATO, cut military spending, and get serious about peace and nonviolence. So I'm encourage everybody to make a submission. But the deadline is November 30th, and you can find out more information on Amnesty International Canada. And then finally, I would like you to mark your calendars. Depending on what happens with the pandemic, we are having a major national peace conference in June of 2021. It's called Divest, Disarm, and Demilitarize. It's time to protest the huge arms show that takes place in Ottawa. It's the biggest one in North America. It's called CANSEC, and this is us protesting last year. So we hope you will join us next year to shut down CANSEC and work with allies across the country for peace and nonviolence in our foreign policy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tamara. Our last speaker for this panel is Comrade Bryn Smith. He was an NDP candidate in the recent British Columbia provincial election. He came within 224 votes of winning the seat in Surrey White Rock. 25 years old, With a master's degree in political science, he worked for the Surrey School District for the last 2 years. Bryn is a leading member of ACORN and Socialist Action in Vancouver. Welcome, Bryn.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on. So to begin with, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement, that I'm speaking to you all from the unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Coast Salish, and Kwantlen First Nations. Thank you to all the other speakers who have been on this panel so far. I really appreciate your in-depth perspective on all of these issues, and so I'll do my best not to rehash anything that you've spoken about. For me, I'm very glad for the chance to speak to this subject, the world in which we want to live. Recent times have introduced all sorts of new challenges to the world order and the capitalist system as it's currently constituted. At the same time, many people, in my experience, struggle to articulate the world they wish to live in. They cannot state for certain how to resolve their own contradictory positions. This is not because they're being hypocrites or acting in bad faith. It's because so often we're asked to react to world events without taking the time to consider what it is that we're fighting for. It is important to hold events like this one so that these conditions and contradictions can be discussed and thought through. To me, the world in which we want to live is based on a few principles. The first is a world in which solidarity with the oppressed the world over is the animating principle of our foreign policy. The second is a world in which the workers run the government, and our governing structures are designed to help the working people. Finally, a world in which work is for the people, not for the needs of corporations. These three animating principles help me to understand our world and what we need from it. It also helps guide my understanding of what our prescriptions and our demands should look like. So to begin with, I'd like to discuss what international solidarity can look like. This year, myself and my comrades have attended numerous protests. First, it was to protest the American war designs on Iran. Then we attended rallies in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en peoples against the oil and gas companies. On top of that, we attended multiple Black Vancouver rallies, rallies for International Women's Day, and virtual rallies for solidarity with Cuba and Venezuela. All these events, some might say, are unrelated. Each issue appears to be in complete isolation from one another. I hear from people who suggest that these are merely opportunistic. They see no connective tissue that would draw our attention to all of these issues as part of a broader whole. In the current market of social media, I can see why. Social media has never been an outlet of emancipation. Instead, it channels and safely diverts energy from bringing about actual change into a safe outlet. What we need is genuine solidarity with people the world over. When we demand change domestically, we must realize that our material prosperity is dependent on the peoples of the developing world, who produce nearly everything we consume. We must recognize that our work does not stop at our own borders. While these aforementioned issues may look disparate and unconnected, they stem from the fundamental recognition that so long as some of us are chained, none of us are free. Secondly, our workers must be in charge of our government. In the last few months under COVID-19 have viscerally demonstrated across the Western world how little our governments are actually able to do in the face of a society-wide crisis. In fact, the COVID crisis showcases our decades and decades of weakness and failures, which came predominantly from ignoring our workers and putting corporate profits first. The downloading of healthcare and social services onto the provinces, which cannot print money to finance these important cornerstones of our society, led to a reduction in ICU beds by 1/3 in BC alone in the last 20 years. Rampant privatization of seniors care, again due to provincial downloading, led to horrifying outcomes during COVID. We all know the stories of for-profit care homes abandoning seniors to die after outbreaks were declared. The need for a consumer economy has led to bizarre rolling lockdowns, where we aren't to visit our friends, but we are expected to work, to shop, and attend school. Even our CERB had to be wrung from the Trudeau Liberal government by the NDP, the only Labour-based party in Canada. All of this must change. The pandemic has shown clearly what our way forward must be. We need a government that will run not only for the workers, but by the workers. In Alberta, wildcat strikes are taking place to demand an end to the privatizing of healthcare. In Saskatchewan, workers lock themselves out of their oil fields to demand better conditions. We see the demand for our governments to be more and to do more. How we get there, I'll leave to the next panel. Suffice it to say, we must have a government that is by and for working people. Finally, our work must be for the needs of our society and our people, not based on the needs of capital. One detail of our government's COVID response I left out of the previous section is one I wanted to discuss at length here. For every segment of government and media, as the pandemic began in earnest, we were told that masks were not necessary in the fight against COVID. We were told they did nothing. This was always a lie. We can see from countries that have beaten COVID with significantly less resources than our own that masks are critical to keeping infection rates low. So why were we told this? This huge, catastrophic lie was more convenient than the real answer, that North America has a next to no domestic capacity to produce anything that our society actually needs, even as essential as surgical masks. Our foods are increasingly important. Our logging industry is dying in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. Our real estate prices have been allowed to inflate to catastrophic levels. Climate change continues its inexorable march. All of this is allowed to continue because we gave in to capital. We gave in to what they wanted, and what they wanted was an international labor market. Thus, we have no domestic capacity to solve our own problems. The peoples of the third world are dying in increasing numbers, and we simply can't produce what we need. The fact is that at the same time that we face these crises, millions of people in Canada are out of work. First Nations are systematically kept out of our economy, lest they compete with our massive, largely settler-owned and run fishing and logging industries. All of these are consequences of a world where work is for the needs of capitalist profit. Our mining companies are imperialist, dominating African nations and extracting their natural resources while paying their workers pittances. They produce next to no work for Canadians domestically. Yet, because they boost our GDP, they are allowed to exist. They're allowed to continue exploiting the peoples of the developing world. So, I recognize that my speech has been a little shorter. I do want to have a longer Q&A, so I've kept it back a little bit. But I want to leave with a message from 60 years ago on a poster distributed by the Black Panthers, and it reads like this. If you're not employed, it's not because there isn't any work. Just look around. A housing shortage, crime, pollution. We need better schools and parks. Whatever our needs, they all require work. And as long as we have unsatisfied needs, there's work to be done. So ask yourself, what kind of world has work but no jobs? It's a world where work is not related to satisfying our needs. A world where work is only related to satisfying the profit needs of business. This country was not built by the huge corporations or government bureaucracies. It was built by people who work. And it is working people who should control the work to be done. Yet, as long as employment is tied to somebody else's profits, the work won't get done. This could have been written yesterday. The needs of our societies have always been the same. When we locked down BC during the first wave of COVID, the empty streets were filled with possibility. Here was our chance to reevaluate what we wanted our world to look like. We had the chance to build a massive public jobs program, to repurpose our roads, to tackle climate change. Now, in the grips of the second wave, we see that this opportunity did not come to pass. We see a grim acceptance that people will grow sick and die, as if no policy could stop it, as if it's as simple as the march of time. This year especially, we must know the world that we want to win. We must know what that world looks like. And as progressives, we must consider what world our desires are progressing to. If we do not, we're condemned to react forever and watch as late capitalism slips through our grasp once again. Thank you very much for having me on. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so now we're going to go to our producer because there's quite a few questions coming in. And our producer is Kurt Young out in Mississauga. And we're going to try to get through as many as we can. So therefore, we're not going to have a lot of time for each 3 questions, because you will get 3 questions, and Kurt has put them, I do believe, in the chat. So you have up to 4 minutes to answer all 3 if you so wish, 1 or 2 if you so wish, or you can pass if you wish. And the lineup of the panelists for questioning will be Kostas, Tamara, Bryn, and Kathy. So up to 4 minutes. So Kurt?
Okay, so to let our audience know, there's been several people who asked multiple questions, and for the sake of time, we won't ask your second question, only your first. So we start off by asking a question from Barry Weisletter, who asks, what would you panelists say is the most important change that we need? Beyond the eradication of capitalism, what is the most urgent change needed in your view? Second question comes from our comrade YC, and he asks, tomorrow Lorincz question, 2 days ago, Setsko Thurlow called on Trudeau to sign the UN nuclear ban treaty. Besides yourself, can you mention other strong progressive women against endless war and protectors of the earth that we should be paying attention to? How can we act as allies to amplify their message of hope? And our last question comes from Daniel Terade, who asks, can the Greek comrade elaborate on the process by which schools are models for after factories in capitalist society?
Okay, so we'll go to our first panelist, Kostas. Are you muted?
Yes,
Hi,
I'm on.
Kostas.
Hello. Yes, okay. I will start with the third question. And in fact, if I understand well, I mean, what I was not properly understood. I said that factories are models for schools, not that schools are models for factory. I said that the division of labor is decided on the factory, I mean, is implemented on the factory level, and schools are following. Therefore, changes in the education system are following the changes in the organization of the economy. That's my view of how education is organized. In fact, I'm following the international movement of critical education. I am one of the organizers of the international conferences on critical education and critical pedagogy in Europe. And what we are saying is that we have to follow a different model of education. In fact, to disconnect this ring between factory and schools have to become places or spaces for developing critical thinking and critical consciousness in order to prepare students to be part of this great movement to transform, to change society and transform social relations. I mean, that's my idea. And then I will skip the second question, and I will try to answer the question by Barry. And what is the most urgent change needed? And I think for the time being, the spearhead of the attack of the capitalist class is the disorganization of the social space of the working class. And I think in order to be prepared to fight back, we have to resist this effort. We have to stand by the working class. I mean, in order that the working class stay coherent and not be disorganized. They do not let this social rationalism and social distancing promoted as a main policy by the capitalists to disorganize the working class. We have to resist this, and we have to defend social coherence, and we have to state first that the working class has to defend its existence, and the working class can't be saved by the working class alone. That's my idea. That's what I think that it is the most urgent need this period to combat the capitalist offensive. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Tamara?
I think one of the most important things that we can do, along with challenging capitalism, is challenging militarism. We need to push the Canadian government to demilitarize, to move the money from the Department of National Defense to our urgent social and environmental problems. Militarism is literally, it's killing people, it's killing the planet, and it's killing hope. We need to get serious about demilitarization. We need to be able to say that, and we need to push the political parties to take this on. There is just simply no way we are going to be able to deal with the climate crisis if we continue to invest in, fossil fuel powered militarism. If Canada buys 88 new fighter jets for a minimum cost of $19 billion, they are so polluting, so destructive to the climate. There's just no way that we can say that Canada is decarbonizing and meeting the Paris Agreement. So demilitarization is absolutely vital to our work, and it really needs to be one of the central pillars, along with decolonization and socialism. And in terms of this new UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons, it's because of Canada's membership in NATO that Canada is not joining this critical new treaty to abolish the worst weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. We cannot respond to a nuclear weapons attack. I mean, everything is obliterated. The only option for us to eliminate the risk of nuclear weapons is to eliminate nuclear weapons. And this is why this treaty is so important. But in 2016, as countries were adopted a resolution to negotiate this treaty, the United States sent a letter to all of the NATO allies to say, do not participate in these negotiations. Canada did not participate in the negotiations, for this new UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons, and Canada is refusing to sign on to this treaty right now. We are facing two existential crises: the climate crisis and the continuing threat of nuclear weapons. In terms of women's organizations that are working to try to get Canada to join this treaty and to take nuclear disarmament seriously. Of course, the organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, has been working on this issue for 60 years. Internationally, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has also been working very hard for nuclear disarmament. And in fact, in 2017, it was our organizations, we're part of this broader network called the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. Our organizations won the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was Setsuko Thurlow, a Japanese-Canadian woman, who accepted that Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of civil society. And do you know that our Prime Minister is refusing to meet with Setsuko Thurlow? Canada, by virtue of our membership in NATO, we are a nuclear armed state. NATO is refusing to get rid of its nuclear weapons. It relies on a nuclear deterrence, and it has a first strike use policy. So it is mission critical. It is absolutely essential for us to push for Canada out of NATO and to join with allies like the NATO network to dismantle the Atlantic Alliance. So that's what I would like to see. I think peace and nonviolence needs to be essential to the work that we're doing as activists across the country.
Thank you, Tamara. Bryn?
Thank you. Well, when it comes down to the most important change that we need, I struggle. There's so many issues. Just as Tamara pointed out, militarism in our society is a huge problem. We spend far too much on our military for what we are. And I think that also, I want to build on that point a little bit. It derives from a lack of understanding about what Canada is, how it behaves on the world stage, and what our economy is based on. We are, for all intents and purposes, a petrostate. We are a state that relies on oil and increasingly a real estate bubble in order to remain solvent and in order to boost our GDP. I don't think many Canadians understand that. I don't think many Canadians get the implications of that. I don't think they understand why it is that, you know, we're intervening in Haiti. Like, why are we pressuring the Venezuelan government? And why were we one of the first to support the Bolivian coup d'etat? They don't understand because they think of ourselves as peacekeepers. We think of ourselves as peacekeepers. And then when actions happen that totally contradict that, it's simply ignored. It's not discussed. It's not reported by the media. So that is a big issue. But for me, I think what it comes down to is the issues that I can help resolve immediately, or we can work to resolve immediately. So for me, that's the housing crisis, and that's the opioid crisis. Here in BC, it's killing so many people. Opioid overdoses have actually killed far more people than COVID has here in this province in 2020 so far. And the crisis was building from 2016 onwards and even earlier. So what all of this comes down to is we have to build a society and build an economy that puts our people first. We have to build housing for everybody who needs it. We have to make sure that people aren't then dying from diseases of despair, like opioid overdoses and suicides. All of these have to happen immediately. They have to be implemented immediately. They can happen within capitalist society, but capitalist society will simply generate new problems. There will simply be something new to occur. If we defeat climate change without defeating capitalism, capitalism will come into a new crisis that is even more severe. If we manage to solve the housing problem without defeating capitalism, capitalism will find some new way, some new market to enter into in order to survive. It mutates and it continues onwards. I think a lot of people refer to the modern era as late capitalism, and I think that's a little optimistic. I don't think capitalism is going to go away anytime soon. It's extremely adaptable, not only with its internal complications, but because of its internal complications. It is prepared to move into any segment of society that it can in order to perpetuate itself. We have to be ready for that. We have to do what we can to help people in the moment with the resources that we have. We just have to be prepared to stick up for each other and defend one another. But we have to recognize that doing so does not guarantee an end to the problems that we face.
Sorry about that. Yes, Kathy?
Yeah, so I think we have to definitely change government priorities. I think education should be priority number one. Dismantling anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, Islamophobia, and all forms of discrimination. I think it's critical to decolonize education, and it is essential that we learn about each other's cultures and their histories, and not only the Eurocentric curriculum. I think when we speak about the change in education system following the changes in the factory, I think schools were designed to turn out people to fill jobs in factories, and they were designed for specific jobs. But the world we're living in now, we need to be educating our students for jobs that aren't even created yet. So I think as schools, we need to prepare students for this, to be critical thinkers, right? I also think that the world is shrinking. And with the advent of social media, the fact that it's here to stay. So many students are getting many more narratives, this fake news concept. It is so important to be able to decipher fact from fiction, look at your sources, even when you're getting all these reports and studies done, who are the people behind funding it, to train our children to be really mindful. So for example, somebody might say, the cure for a particular illness may be eating blueberries, but is it the Blueberries Farmers Association that have put out this report? So we really need to be critical thinkers. I think just the fact that, I like to say we're in two pandemics. So the pandemic of racism was here long before COVID, and COVID will pass. But our racism pandemic will continue if we are not very decisive and strategic in ending racism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our producer, Kurt, and I think we have 8 questions left. So we're going to do 4 and 4, and you once again will only get up to 4 minutes, strict 4 minutes, okay? And the lineup of the panelists this time will be Kathy, Bryn, Tamara, and Kostas. So Kurt, 4 questions.
Okay, so our first question comes from Abby C. And she said, could unions joining together be a force for uniting workers around the world? Our next question comes from Ross Gertzen, who asked for Cassie, could you speak on the role of educational elitism and how we could move away from education as a meritocracy that favors white people or of financial means? Our next question comes from John Orritt. The carbon emission of the US military, I am told, is larger than many medium-sized nations. Is this true? And our final question for this round comes from Dustin Brown, who asks, what are the positions of the bourgeois parties in Canada on military spending?
Okay, Kathy?
Yeah, so I'm going to start, I'm really going to tackle Ross's question, because that's one of the things I'm very passionate about, because I think it's important to rethink just, for example, how we train our teachers, right? So, and what we value in kids' learning, and also how we see our students. And I think that's the beauty of public education, because public education is supposed to be that for the public. Now, when you look at how it was designed, I remember attending demonstrations and people would say the system isn't broken, it was built this way, right? It is so important to ensure that in public education, we go back to what it's supposed to be, which is education for all people, right? And it is so important to make sure every story is valued. It is so important when you look at the curriculum, how teachers, you look at the pedagogy, how instruction is delivered, how teachers assess and what they value, and all that comes in changing with policies. It comes from, for example, revamping success criteria. What does success look like in a particular scenario? It's no longer has to be like, for example, I remember when, I was going to school and you do a project, it was basically the person who had the most money who built the most elaborate display and project and brought to school. It didn't matter that half the time it was your parents doing it or assisting you with it. It didn't really reflect the child's ability. So looking at what are we assessing? What skills are we looking for, right? And I think it's very important that all school systems, and some places they call it school districts, come on board, because it's so important when you look even, for example, at how we want our kids of the future to be. So it's not going to be only, the people that can, let's say, I have the most money, so I build the biggest project, but we want our students to be critical thinkers, to be able to be problem solvers and creativity, because that's also a huge need, right, in jobs of the future. Collaboration. So I think there are a lot of skills, and what I call hard skills and soft skills also, that in an education system that we need to focus and pay more attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, Bryn?
Thank you. I really like all these questions. I wish I had a little more time.
Well, we got 4 minutes, comrade.
All right, we're going with it. So unions joining together could be a force for uniting workers around the world. I think they could be, for sure. My main worry is that a lot of the top union brass can be very conservative. They don't see the need for international solidarity, and in fact can often work against it. Unifor, when GM was moving jobs out of Ontario into Mexico, responded by calling for a boycott on all Mexican-produced cars, which A, how is anybody supposed to know which cars are Mexican-produced or not? And B, it reinforces the capitalist idea, which is of an international labor market and we're all competing with each other, when instead the workers of the world should be uniting together to make common demands and common cause. Campaigns like that really hurt that kind of solidarity building. So I do believe that unions joining together could be a force for uniting workers, but at the same time, you do have to overcome the conservatism of the union leadership in a lot of cases. The carbon emissions of the US military, I'm told, is larger than many medium-sized nations. Is this true? Yes. And especially when you consider what they're blowing up and how much it costs to rebuild the devastation that they leave behind. Virtually none of the US military is carbon efficient. But what's funny is that it leads down interesting paths. I know Elizabeth Warren, for instance, her campaign platform wasn't to end US militarism or to scale it back. It was to put more solar panels on the tanks and to use more like, I don't know, solar powered like tents, basically. There wasn't an actual interest in ending the institution of militarism. There was an interest in just making it greener and friendlier, which we know that's not the prescription. We know that we have to scale down the US war machine in order to secure world peace. And so the fourth, what are the positions of the bourgeois parties in Canada on military spending? The positions of the parties are pretty much uniformly whatever the military wants, we'll give it to them. The military complains a lot about, oh, we're being underfunded. Oh, we don't have this, we don't have that. Yet, as Tamara's presentation pointed out, we spend a great deal more on the military than we do on fighting climate change. We spend it on frivolous purchases like the F-35, which was at one point nicknamed the flying guillotine because in test for pilots, there was a 1 in 4 chance of them being decapitated if they attempted to eject in an emergency. Like, this is the kind of thing that we're spending all of our money on. Its code name was the Lightning, and yet it was delayed for 3 years because whenever it was hit by lightning, all the engines and electronics would switch off and the plane would crash. There's no sense there. It's purely, honestly, I would have to spend a lot more than the remaining time that I have to discuss what I actually think about it. But I think for the liberals and conservatives, the conservatives are in favor of increased military spending. The liberals are also in favor of increased military spending, but with a friendlier face, like a feminist foreign policy, as if, the women don't also die from bombs that are dropped by our planes. But the NDPs, more or less, well, we haven't really thought about that. I guess we'll just go with whatever the military wants.
30 seconds.
I think, okay, thank you. I think that's actually a weakness of the federal NDP. I think there's a lot of opportunities for them to differentiate themselves on foreign policy that they don't take. And I think what it comes down to is an assumption that, well, we're never taking power anyways. So who cares what we think about foreign policy? Who cares what we think about all of these things? But as I've mentioned before, Canadians think of themselves as peacekeepers. While that hurts our understanding of what our country does, it can help our understanding of what our country can do. And I think having a non-interventionist foreign policy, having a military policy that winds down our investments can be a huge draw to a workers' party. And I think that it's a huge chance for them to differentiate themselves. So for me, that's what I think about those questions. And they're all very good. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryn. Okay, Tamara?
So as I showed in my chart, that under the Liberals and the Conservatives, military spending has dramatically increased over the past 20 years. And under the Liberals' 2017 defense policy, we're going to be spending over $553 billion on new weapon systems and more military interventions. When that policy came out, the Green Party said nothing. Silence is acquiescence. The NDP, Randall Garrison, the defense critic, actually said that this spending is not enough. The NDP's position is that they would like to see even greater military spending. So I am urging people on this call who are involved in the Green Party and the NDP to push them on reducing military spending and reallocating it to social environmental programs that we desperately need in this country. I also want to say that unions in this country, most of them are also very supportive of military spending. So, for instance, the union that operates in London, that's helping to build the light armored vehicles at the General Dynamics plant, are very supportive of military spending and arms exports. The unions in Quebec, where a lot of the aerospace and defense sector corporations are based, are extremely supportive of Canadian militarism. And so I'm also appealing to unions and to workers to reflect critically about supporting militarism and to think about conversion. I mean, we absolutely need to convert our aerospace and defense sector into building technologies and building things that we need, that Bryn was alluding to, and to building things like affordable housing and healthcare and schools and recreation centers that are needed across this country. There's an organization called Labor Against the Arms Trade that is trying to raise awareness about the possibility for conversion and appealing to labor and to unions to get serious about becoming allies for peace and nonviolence in this country. And then finally, on the question about the U.S. military, and climate change, the U.S. military spends between $8 and $17 billion on fuel. It is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. We know this from repeated congressional testimony. Last year, Brown University Costs of War Project released a study called Pentagon Fuel Use and Climate Change. I'd encourage you to have a look at this study. And it's in that study that they tried to estimate what the U.S. military's carbon emissions are. And based on their assessment, they say that the U.S. military emits more carbon emissions than 146 countries. And at its level of military emissions, it emits as many emissions as middle-sized countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. But those countries have about 5 million people. The U.S. military is only 2 million soldiers. So the U.S. military has a massive carbon footprint. And then I'll just end by saying that among all federal agencies and institutions in this country, it's the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces that emits most of the carbon emissions. The Canadian military is also one of the largest consumers of hazardous material and producers of hazardous waste, and it has the most contaminated sites in this country. So militarism is extremely pernicious to the environment, and that is why demilitarization to save the planet and to save people is absolutely vital.
Thank you, Tamara. Kostas?
Yes, concerning the first question about uniting workers through the unions, through the trade unions. I mean, there is a historical experience, the International of the Trade Unions, that was an international coordination of trade unions and workers' unions around the world, and that was a policy of the Third International in the 30s, and this union and this international fall apart due to Stalinist intervention. But it was not only due to Stalin's intervention that this international fall apart. We have to look through unions, workers' unions or trade unions are as defensive organizations of the working class. They cannot take combat initiatives as such. Moreover, trade unions are governed by trade unions bureaucracy. So it is not in the interest of the trade union bureaucracy to unite the workers globally. What is the the tool that we need to unite the workers globally are revolutionary parties of the working class, mass revolutionary parties of the working class, and an international of revolutionary parties that is going to coordinate the struggles of workers internationally. Now I come over to the second question. Education is an ideological state apparatus, and as such is in close contact with state policy. Education and, in fact, the curricula, the official curricula put forward by governments, are designed centrally, and in fact, their main purpose is to promote neoliberal policy into education. What is the neoliberal policy for education? Education is under attack by neoliberalism. And this started by Thatcher in Britain in the late 70s. And the main policy of neoliberalism in education is to promote skills in the expense of knowledge. This is what the Secretary of Education of Thatcher in 1979 voiced explicitly in the UK, that skills, not knowledge. And why skills? Either soft skills or hard skills. Because schools have to prepare a flexibly working force to work in the factories. We don't have to educate in terms of knowledge, in terms of theoretical and abstract thinking, but we have to concentrate on knowledge, because a worker in the factory has to be prepared to use her skills to change his work or his job, 3 or 4 or even 10 times in his work life. And we have to combat neoliberalism in education. And we have to combat the OECD policies, because the normalization of education to the policy of neoliberalism passes through the PISA test and the OECD policies in education. So either we develop a coherent critique of OECD and neoliberalist policies in education, or we are defensive but we accept our fate. And so if we want to make a breakthrough in education, we have to combat the neoliberal policy. And the first step to combat the neoliberal policy is to re-educate teachers, re-educate the educators. The educator must be educated again. This is what Marx said, and this is up to this day, a very sound saying. Okay, educators have to be transformative intellectuals. So we have to work in the trade unions of the educators' union and the teachers' union. Okay, I'm off. We have to concentrate our political work to teachers. We have to prepare the new teacher, the teacher of the future, the teacher who is be an intellectual, an organic and transformative intellectual. That's my point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Okay, so we're going to hear our last 4 questions now, but the time is now 5:43. We're supposed to be finished by 6, but I will give each of you 4 minutes. But please, please, please keep to the 4 minutes, because we're not supposed to really be going over the 6 o'clock mark. So the lineup will be Tamara, Kostas, Kathy, and Bryn. So Kurt?
All right, our first question comes from Stephen Crozier. He asks, are you aware of the organization World Beyond War? Our question comes from our comrade YC. Second question for Kathy. How come you do not advocate for abolish the police, having worked with core group of NPPC, No Pride in Police Coalition? I say you don't go far enough. What's your response? Question from Dustin Brown. Where are the vulnerable points of the military industrial manufacturing sector in Canada? Is general dynamics in London a potential point of focus for organizing? And Galen Ash asks, can the speakers provide contact info for follow-up questions? And I'll add to this quickly, is that if you do have contact information you wish to share, please put it in the chat and we will put it in the profile. Thank you.
Okay, so 4 minutes and only 4 minutes to the panelists. Tamara?
Yes, I do know World Beyond War. It's an excellent organization. It's based in the United States, but it has chapters and allied organizations around the world. There is actually a World Beyond War Canadian coordinator. Her name is Rachel Small, and she's absolutely excellent. The next World Beyond War webinar will be on freeing Meng Wanzhou on Tuesday, November 24th. You can find more information if you go to the World Beyond War website. They have excellent resources. Last week, they had this absolutely fantastic webinar on ending the war in Afghanistan. I encourage you to tune into that. They also have a peace pledge that you can sign and many other petitions that you can sign, including hosting a petition for us to call on the Canadian government to cancel the fighter jet procurement. We actually have an opportunity to stop Canada from buying new fighter jets. The Canadian government hasn't made a decision if it's going to buy the F-35, the Boeing Super Hornets, or the Saab Gripen. They're not going to make that decision for another year. So if we put adequate pressure, we can stop them. And World Beyond War is helping us. I'd also encourage people to check out the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. We also host many excellent webinars, and we have petitions too that you can sign on. Another fantastic organization to follow is the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which which profiles many progressive foreign policy activists, including Eve Engler, and they have a petition on their website calling on the Canadian government to have a fundamental reassessment of Canadian foreign policy. And then finally, I'd like to remind you about Labor Against the Arms Trade. Labor Against the Arms Trade has organized, this is led by Professor Simon Black at Brock University. We've organized 2 National Day of Actions to outside the General Dynamics plant in London to try to get them to stop building light armored vehicles that we're sending to Saudi Arabia and that are being used in this brutal war against Yemen. The next National Day of Action will be in January and will be part of an international solidarity action. So I encourage you to get involved in peace work as well. We really need you, and there's a lot of work to be done. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. Kostas?
Yes, in fact, I think I'm not eligible enough to answer these questions because mainly require, a knowledge of the political and social situation in Canada. So what I'm going to say is that the struggle against militarism is something very important. It is part of our tradition. It is part of an anti-capitalist program. The military complex and the military economy is a very vital sector for capitalist economy. Is a third, we usually talk about the production of goods, the production of means of production, and now we talk about the production of means of destruction. So it is a very vital sector for the capitalist economy. Our first task is to organize workers in the military industrial complex. That's I think our first priority. And second is to think in terms of militarism as an ideology in the society, and therefore we also have to educate people against militarism and nationalism. So the two tasks are interconnected. organizing workers in the military sector, and third, combat militarism and nationalism and patriotism in a sense, okay, also in the society as ideologies. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, Kathy?
Yeah, so thank you. So to respond to the question of how come I don't advocate for the abolishing of the police, well, I think I don't subscribe to that philosophy, because I think we do need the police, but I just don't believe we need them in our schools. I believe that in defunding the police, so the $9 million, for example, that we used for annually for the SRO program, I think it should be reinvested into social programs, into programs that enhance opportunities for young people. I believe in preventative actions rather than waiting for our youth to get into trouble and then reacting. So I believe in being proactive. When you look, for example, at the SRO program in schools, you have, for example, cases where kids are being permanently traumatized by police officers. You have some police officers that are honing their skills on Black children primarily and Indigenous children. So they may trump up charges and they practice, for example, how to get somebody to confess to something they didn't do. They would, charge a kid and then, knowing that they don't have a case, and try to get them to go to some different, I forgot the name of it right now, a divergent program, I think it's called. So these are the things that I think that we need to eliminate from an educational system. I think it is very important that our youth are not targeted and not marginalized before they can even go out into the world. I also believe that educating our young people is the most important way for them to achieve and better their current circumstances. And by educating, I don't only mean necessarily getting a skill. I believe in truly letting our young people be critical thinkers. And I think that is why our education system, a lot of the powers that be, don't want to have an educated populace, educated people, because it's harder to manipulate people when they are educated and they can see through the smoke, right? And I think that it is easier to mislead and sell your propaganda when you have an educated society. So my focus is on education and ensuring that all students get educated. And I think that in terms of defunding the police, I always say that if I am staring at the end of a barrel or somebody's about to harm me, the police is who I would look to call, because I'm not armed. I don't, so I would look for help if in those situations, but I don't think they belong in our schools. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Bryn?
Sure thing. Well, I do feel the pressure to wrap up quickly, so I will do my best to get through
Sorry about
these
the pressure.
questions. No worries. So I am aware of the organization World Beyond War, and I'll defer to Tamara's comments on both that, as well as the vulnerable points of the military-industrial manufacturing sector. But I do want to say, as someone who lived in London, Ontario for 5 years, there's a broader context there that I think I hinted at earlier on, but I'd like to address a bit more specifically. So I mentioned that First Nations and Indigenous people, especially on reservations, tend to be locked out of the economy. They're not always locked out of the economy. In BC, oil companies are more than willing to give them tons of money. So in a sense, it becomes a devil's bargain. Sure, you can have a local economy and you can have good local jobs. It just has to come at the expense of the planet. And because we spent so long discriminating against them, taking their, I have to keep scrolling up to see the questions again, taking their jobs and that sort of thing, this is what we're left with. And in London, Ontario, it's much the same way. Car manufacturing has totally abandoned the city. When GM moved to close their plant, the Ontario government, despite having given the GM $2 billion to keep their manufacturing in Ontario, just said, oh, well, nothing we can do about it. They just gave up. They didn't even bother trying. That $2 billion bought them nothing. No sway, no stake in the companies, nothing. So when it comes down to it, General Dynamics is one of the few places left in London, Ontario, which will offer good paying jobs that are not knowledge economy based jobs, that are manufacturing jobs. So by proxy, they're pulled into defending militarism, because if those jobs disappear, they know that there is nothing to replace them. There is not going to be another factory that is making something ethically produced that's good for the people that will spawn overnight. Instead, it'll just be another massive 3,000 to 4,000 person job loss. So for us, if we want to really defeat the military-industrial complex, I think what we have to have an alternative. If we want to defeat all of these things that people are working on and towards, we have to have alternatives in place that are ready for them, so that they don't have to lose their jobs, so that they don't have to lose their incomes. So I think that that's sort of just a little bit of a missing piece that I wanted to add in, because like I said, I've lived in London, Ontario for a good amount of time. So I'm aware of the conditions there, and they're dire. There's a lot of poverty in London, Ontario, and a great deal of that is because those manufacturing jobs moved away. We just have to be ready with alternative prescriptions. We have to be ready with an alternative that can be brought in. It's the same with oil and gas. If we want to preserve those jobs, the best thing we can do is to come up with some kind of alternative industry that will pay a similar amount, that will still be unionized, that will still keep all those people on board. We have to build an economy that works for people, not for corporate profit. And that's how we build something long term. That's how we build something sustainable. So I want to thank you for all the questions. Can the speakers provide contact info for follow-up questions? Yes. So you can follow me on Twitter at Bryn Smith SWR. I can paste that into the mainline chat as well. That's the main public way that you can reach me. But I want to thank you for having me on. I want to thank all the other speakers, because I learned so much from listening to you all, and you're all amazing. So thank you.
Thank you, comrades. We are nearing the end of our first session. So I would like to thank all the participants, and a special thanks to our panelists, Kathy, Tamara, Kostas, and Bryn. And also, just say before I leave you, a pause for the cause. If you would like to subscribe to our newspaper, Socialist Action newspaper, which will be delivered to your door for $27 for 1 year. Or maybe you would like to get our latest booklet, which is Democratize and Nationalize Scientific Publishing by Daniel Turade. So, and also if you would like to talk to us at Socialist Action, just give us a call at 416, no, that's wrong, it's 647-986-1917, or you can reach us at www.socialistaction.ca. Or you can also reach us at at Socialist Action Canada at gmail.com. And maybe while you're there, you might see a link to funding. So if you would like to make a donation to offset some of the cost of our conference for webcasts, leafleting, and the different things that goes with it, or for us to continue in our work in the class struggle. So if you'd like to do that, you can also do it. And also, don't forget, if you like the webcasts, and the one tonight and the one coming and the ones we've been having every Thursday night, you can subscribe to the SA YouTube channel. That's the Socialist Action YouTube channel. And so we will see you all back here at 7 sharp tonight for the second session. And in the meantime, in between time, during the intermission, you can watch, if you so wish, videos, musical videos on the band Special Interest Group. So until 7, bye for now. Bye, Kostas.
Bye. See you all.
Thank you. Welcome back to the Education for Activists Conference, our 7 o'clock session. The first session was the change we need. And now we will learn and discuss with our speakers how to get it. So for those joining us for the first time in this session, my name is Elizabeth and I'm will be your host of the conference. And as before, we invite the participants in the discussion via the chat column. They can put their questions in at any time because we want to learn from you as well. And as I said earlier, this conference is presented by Socialist Action. We are approaching our 27th year in revolutionary politics. Socialist Action's organization party is made up of workers, students, women, men, youth, veterans of the class struggle. So, once again, welcome to the 7 o'clock session, How to Get It. Our speakers are Radhika Desai, John Clark, Julius Arscott, and Lisa Leuenberg. But before we go to our panelists, whom I will introduce one at a time, we are in for a treat. A song by Y.C. Lee. Y.C. joined Socialist Action about 2 years ago. So please get into the music.
Avanti o popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, avanti o popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, trionferà. Bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà. Bandiera rossa la trionferà, e viva il socialismo e la libertà. Dai campi al mare, alla miniera, all'officina, chi soffre e spera, sia pronto è l'ora della riscossa. Bandiera rossa trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, soltanto il socialismo e verrà libertà. Falange audace, cosciente e fiera, dispiega il sole, rosa bandiera, lavoratori alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà. E viva il comunismo e la
libertà. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, but I had to leave for a moment or so there. But to get back to why it was YC that you heard singing. And YC joined Socialist Action about 2 years ago following the launch of Yves Engler's book, Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperialist Canada. Most recently, he has participated in the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition and the No Pride in Police Coalition. YC's recording projects include Solo, Messiah Project, Solo Recital Debut, and Solo Dowland Project. In addition, YC performs opera and art songs favorite. Awards include a gold medal from the Royal Conservatory of Music. So thank you very much, YC. And now we're going to hear a poem from Comrade Alec Badila. He joined Socialist Action just 2 months ago. He is a computer programmer who likes to do creative writing in his spare time. Okay, Alex.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, comrades. I'm Alex, and I wrote a poem. This poem is also a song, so I will be singing it. Now, I don't have the kind of chops that comrades Emily and YC have, but I'll try my best. This song is called COVID-19, The Breakdown of Capitalism. A pandemic has reached our land, ruining everything we have planned. I placed this cloth over my face, thinking of this great disgrace. They responded way too late, leaving many to their fate. There are some who still have to work as the world around them goes berserk. We have to wait till the vaccine, yeah, we return to feed the great machine. Ah! The poor are dropping dead like flies, but you still can't look me in the eye. I say this cold hard fact to you. You say there's nothing you can do. You still worry about the economy. You want the market to be free. They go forward with reopening as the lives of people are cheapening. That is quite a massive task, as some people will not wear a mask, and social distancing ain't a thing. As you hear the bells of freedom ring, those bells are for your funeral. It's all goddamn delusional. The kids are going back to school because the government is cruel. That will cause a massive spread. Many people will drop dead. It's unraveling bit by bit. Serb is not enough, you shits. I turn to socialism now. To incompetence I will not bow. Waiting for revolution. There must be some evolution to a stateless society. I just want us to be free. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you, Alex. Okay, so now we're going to go to our speakers, and our first speaker is Radhika Desai. She's a professor, Department of Political Studies, and director, Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. She is the author of Geopolitical Economy. She is a member of the Venezuela Peace Committee in Winnipeg and was featured on the September 10th Socialist Action website. Is there a magic money tree? So welcome back, Radhika.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks to Elizabeth, thanks Barry, thanks Skurt, and everyone who's organized this. Glad to be back. I think, this is a very important type of event that you're holding, and there's no doubt that as Alex's poem and many of the other things that were said in the earlier session clearly show, I think the pandemic has definitely landed capitalism itself into a major knockdown crisis. And I think that we on the left need to act very fast. When I was given this title, after what we want, we are supposed to address the question of how to get it. I think I should preface what I have to say by saying that if I really knew the answer to that, I would be leading a world revolution right now. So everything I have to say should be understood in that format. What I've done is I've put together some thoughts on what is I consider to be a very key preliminary to answering the question how we can get it. And that preliminary is the question, why has the left not advanced over the past 4 decades of neoliberalism, or 40 years of neoliberalism? I think that and these reflections are largely concern our understanding of what's going on. Obviously, there are other elements to the answer to the question, but I will focus on those relating to understanding, because I think that while Marx was very right to say that the important thing are the material developments, at the same time, the understanding of those material developments can do a great deal to hasten the course of revolutions, of transformation, and to limit the suffering that is caused otherwise. So I have actually a dozen odd points to make. So I'm going to make them very quickly. The first couple will perhaps appear to you a little abstract, and you may go like, what does this have to do with what we are discussing today? But bear with me, and I think you will see a pattern emerging, and I look forward to the questions and answers. So here goes. My first point is that, of course, neoliberalism itself as a policy ideology, we understand this as a particular type of policy package of essentially giving more and more freedoms to capital by deregulating, lowering taxes, privatizing, etc., etc. What we often fail to recognize is that it represents the ascendance for the first time since its birth of neoclassical economics. And what has also happened at the same time with the rise of this neoliberalism and neoclassical economics since over the last 40 years is the rise of what I call Marxist economics, in quotation marks. And I consider that to be a rather regressive development. So bear with me and I will tell you what I mean. So first of all, although neoclassical economics was born circa 1870, it didn't really actually become very influential until the 1970s and 80s, chiefly because initially there was some resistance to it because of the legacy of classical political economy and other methods, institutionalist, historical, of studying economics. And then, of course, critics like Keynes particularly emerged. And so the entire middle of the 20th century was dominated by Keynesian understanding. So really, neoclassical economics gets its day only from the 1980s onwards. And the problem with that are two. Number one, seriously and realistically, it tries to theorize with the ideology and theory of competition what has already become a monopoly capitalism. And secondly, that it is totally antithetical to Marxism. And unfortunately, what counts for Marxist economics has been trying to fit Marx's antithetical understanding into the framework of neoclassical economics for the last a long time. So that's my first point. And therefore, we need to go back and study what Marx, as well as other critics of capitalism before him and since, have had to say, rather than just listen to what Marxist economics says, because Marxist economics has actually had a very conservatizing influence on us. My second point, therefore, is that this Marxist economics essentially led to a questioning of Marxist analysis of capitalism, particularly in three ways. Number one, they threw out Marx's value analysis and said basically that we could not entertain it because it suffered from the so-called transformation problem, could not translate values into prices consistently. This really is a problem that arises not in Marx, but because of that is to say, Marxist economists attempt to fit Marxism into neoclassical economics. And they said a couple of other things that arise from the same space. The first, that they claim that Marx never talked about demand being the paucity of demand being a problem in capitalism. This is simply not true. Marx wrote oodles about it. It's just their way of trying to say we are not Keynesians, and not being Keynesian is supposed to give you a badge of radicalism. This is all really rubbish. There's actually a lot of commonality between what Marx said and what Keynes said, but that's another point. Second, the other thing they said is that Marx was wrong about falling profits, that profits don't fall, etc. The point of saying all this is that we need to look at Marx's real critique of capitalism as a form of value production rather than use value production, understand its contradictions, which later thinkers have actually reinforced rather than rejected. So my third point is that this kind of Marxist economics intervention has left us with a conception of capitalism that is more Schumpeterian than it is Marxist. These Marxist economists celebrate capitalism for its prodigious productivity and innovation. They throw out, as I've already said, key concepts of crises. They basically say that there is no endogenous or economic crisis in capitalism. So the only crisis is political crisis, etc. And therefore, what we need to do is we need to understand capitalism's limitations as a system of production anew. We need to put the contradictions of capitalism at the heart of our understanding. So that was my third point. My fourth point is related. Just as you got Marxist economics, so you also, let me start again. Neoclassical economics actually lies at the heart of a new social scientific division of labor that emerged in the late 19th century. So in the center was the separation of economics from sociology, sanctified by Max Weber, and then around it have arisen all the other social scientific division of labor around the neoclassical economics. So you first got sociology, political science, you get geography and what have you. What this has also done is it has given rise to social scientific Marxism. So you get, Marxist sociology and Marxist political science and blah, blah. And so Marxist international relations and so on. This has generated a whole lot of false problems. The key problem being, is Marxism economic determinist? Well, you can only complain about the determination of the political or the cultural by the economic if you have already separated the two. Marx was a historical thinker. He never separated them in the first place. He saw all these elements of the whole as being mutually conditioning one another. And if they emphasized materialism, it was as much to point to its objective reality, which most people would agree with, but also to contest the bourgeois tendency to think it's all in the head. It all begins and ends with what we think. And so with regard to that, we need to go back to studying social reality historically, not cut it up into bits and not study it as though it is simply the eternal repetition of the same pattern, but to see it as a historically changing reality. So my fifth point is that this tendency of essentially this kind of left variant of neoliberalism has essentially neglected imperialism. Until the 1970s, sort of basically from the, certainly from the Bolshevik Revolution up until the 1970s, you could not really discuss Marxism and a Marxist analysis of society without looking at imperialism. Imperialism was the main focus of much Marxist scholarship. Since the 1970s, since the sort of creation of this Marxist economics and so on, what we've got is that major schools of Marxism deny the necessary relationship between capitalism and imperialism. This also makes the understanding of the third world, of the imperialized world, and even the former second world, like essentially the Soviet Union and its history, and today's China, etc., and the struggles of these countries, they make it impossible to understand. And by the way, the reason for the neglect of imperialism is that under the influence of neoclassical economics, they tend to see capitalism as a self-contained system, so that it does not, whereas Marx saw capitalism as a contradictory system that constantly reached beyond itself in order to externalize the consequences of its contradictions, otherwise known as imperialism. So because you think of it this way, we have been denying the reality and the necessity of the link between imperialism and capitalism. And therefore, we do not understand the struggles of the third world, and therefore the associated struggles around development, etc., etc. And also, it has the important, critically important result that we mystify the real sources of the West's wealth. In a lot of Marxist theorization, the West's wealth is simply endogenous. But the capitalism is simply this super productive system that accounts for the wealth of Western countries. So it is the wealth is attributed to the dynamism of capitalism rather than what is really responsible for it, the exploitative relationship between the first world and the rest of the world. Marx, by the way, put the exploitation of one class by another right next to the exploitation of one nation by another. So we should not forget that. So that implies that we need to study the operations of imperialism today as well as historically. We need to understand what a critical role imperialism has played even in the beginnings of capitalism in the first world countries. And this kind of understanding will also strengthen us in not falling for the claims of our ruling classes, of Western ruling capitalist classes about, that demonize Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, etc., etc. We need to understand all those things. My sixth point is related to this. If you don't understand imperialism, you will never understand the centrality of nations and national economies in capitalism. You will learn to see, as the West wants you to see, as neoclassical economics wants you to see, as the dominant ideologies of the West want you to see, you will learn to see the world economy as if it were a cosmopolitan, seamless whole in which national borders don't matter. The West will easily fall prey, as it has, in fact, to discourses about American hegemony, globalization, American empire, and what have you. These are the 20th century versions of the old 19th century ideology of free trade, which saw the world economy as a seamless whole in which national borders were simply irrelevant, at best cultural objects. And this also enables us to completely leave out the central role states have had, whether you have capitalist states or you have communist, socialist communist states, in increasing productive capacity around the world. And unless we put that understanding at the center of our understanding of what economies are, how our present economy functions, we will not understand how we are going to transform it into one that works better for ordinary people, for working people of all stripes. So this implies that we need to place nation states and national economies at the core of our understanding of our struggles against capitalism and at the same time against imperialism and towards the advancement of socialism. And doing this, understanding that nations are really the path along which our struggles will go forward, as Marx also said many times, it will also allow us to allow us to stop mistaking the rejection of reformism for the rejection of reforms. Marx and Engels would have never said that reforms are not important. Reformism is the belief that all we have to do is tinker a little bit with capitalism and all will be fine. But reforms are the critical stepping stones to revolution, and we have to understand that. Seventh point, the incomprehension that this kind of non-understanding of national realities of all our economies, whether first world or third world or everything in between, this has led to an incomprehension about why you have why socialism has taken national forms, as in China or Cuba or Venezuela or the Soviet Union, etc. And also how economies have really become more productive. And so again, we tend to fall for the Western criticisms of these countries as essentially being authoritarian dictatorships, etc., because this also allows us to mix up market freedoms with human freedoms. We should actually understand that state intervention is necessary in practically any kind of economy, whether you want to organize it in a capitalist fashion or in a socialist fashion. And so what we need to do is exactly how to make this work with the preservation of those freedoms we value, rather than simply equate the liberal imperialist West with freedoms and those who are resisting it with unfreedom. So the neglect of the centrality of imperialism and imperialist threats against these countries also allows us to very easily portray these societies as inherently authoritarian, etc., while completely forgetting about the terrible situation democracy is in our time. My eighth point is that this has led us, the Western left generally, to a lack of attention to the overall organization of the economy, and therefore what we need to do to take control of it. This requires taking seriously the need for a party and the need for planning. Instead, what you have is what I call network politics, instead of a serious thinking about how a party should be created, organized, etc. You get network politics and what I call Proudhonist economics, or this idea that somehow if we just have cooperatives and state worker-controlled enterprises and so on, that this is going to be the end of all our troubles. It's not. You're going to have to think about some kind of overall national, to begin with, organization of your economy if you're going to advance towards any kind of socialism. So we need to think about parties and planning and focus on how to make them democratic, how to make them participatory. 9. The influence of neoclassical.
Radhika, please, you're way over time. You have to wrap up.
Okay, well, you know what? I will just make one final point, and then we'll make everything else in the discussion. So the final point is this: that this kind of thinking has also is part of a larger scene in which historically the bond between critical intellectuals and the working class has been broken. Instead of a trend which we used to have well into the 20th century of critical intellectuals allying with working class forces, now we have pretty well the entire intellectual class, whether they work for the private sector or the state, forming part of an establishment and reflecting the consensus that we have today of neoliberalism, and only neoliberalism combined with social liberalism, and generally forgetting about class politics. So I'm sorry I've gone over time. I had a couple more things to say, but I will end there, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Yes, I'm sorry that we have to keep everybody 2 to 15 minutes, but we want to leave time for questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So our next panelist is John Clark. He became active in anti-poverty struggles when he helped to form the Union of Unemployed Workers in London, Ontario in 1983. It was one of the groups that established the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in 1990. John moved to Toronto to become an OCAP organizer, helping to mobilize poor communities resisting neoliberal austerity. 2 years ago, he retired. Well, not really. I don't think John will ever retire, but he just retired from that position. But he continues to campaign widely and to lecture at York University on these very issues. So welcome, Comrade John.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, if I'm asked to say, how do we get the change we need? The short answer is, as the title of this gathering suggests, revolution, social revolution. In a certain sense, that's my response, but I perhaps feel I need to be a little bit more expansive than that and develop it a little further. But I think when we talk in terms of revolution, those of us who have advanced for long periods of our life, the concept of the revolutionary transformation of this society, the end of capitalism, the creation of a socialist society. I don't think we've ever been in a situation where there has been such stark immediacy to that goal and to that political project. The sharpness of the crisis that we are now in is really quite remarkable. This vast pandemic crisis, a deep economic crisis that was already forming prior to the pandemic, but that has been intensified dramatically by the lockdowns, by the partial economic shutdowns, and all of the disruption that's created. And then, of course, looming over it all, this vast ecological crisis that is reaching points that are really stark and really, really dangerous. And they are not just abstract possibilities, they are intruding in people's lives in ways that are absolutely unimaginable. And that is, I think, that really is creating a situation where we are talking about the prospects of organizing for revolution in a situation where it's no longer that capitalism is not compatible with a decent future or with the development of the human personality, with goals of building a society that's worthy of living decently and well for people. But we're actually talking about a situation where the existence of this system is becoming incompatible with human survival. And so in that situation, people's lives are being shaken up dramatically, and there are big changes in the way people are thinking. workers, the communities that they live in are being profoundly changed by this situation. And it's reflected in things like opinion polls, where, you have Ipsos Reid in Canada conducting a survey in which 70% of people say that in Canada we need fundamental change. We've seen this incredible explosion of a struggle for racial justice taking place, coming out of the United States, but spreading. So these are incredibly volatile times. And if we need to have bold perspectives about the struggle for socialism and for revolution, I think we also need to recognize that these are times when which incredible leaps in people's consciousness can take place. And so in that situation, the task obviously is to organize revolutionary organizations. The task is obviously to build a large mass consciousness of people consciously working for the revolutionary change of this society. But that kind of movement on the scale that's necessary is going to, of course, require conditions of mass struggle. And those are the things that we are held back by. All the edifices and bureaucracies of compromise and that seek to limit the struggle and seek to prevent it from breaking out of the bounds are continue to hold us back. And we have to find ways, I think, if we are advancing ideas of revolutionary socialism, we have to find ways of making those ideas relevant, but doing so in the context of participating in and advancing bold demands within movements that are struggling around the struggle, really struggles of solidarity for survival that are breaking out in this situation. In this very city, the example could be given of the prospect of and the unfolding reality of mass evictions. The Ford government is now talking about some kind of return to lockdown conditions, and yet the previous moratorium on evictions has not been reimposed. On the contrary, they have moved the eviction process online, and with scant due process, people are being evicted. And what is really looming is the prospect of tens of thousands of people across this country, hundreds of thousands of people. In the United States, they're talking in terms of as many as 28 million people losing their housing. That's an absolutely dramatic situation. If that were achieved, if that were imposed on working class communities, the defeat would be enormous. But on the other hand, a bold movement that was able to challenge those evictions, was able to fight back against them, and at the same time link that to transformative, bold, radical demands has incredible possibilities. I give that as an example. There are many areas of struggle where I think this continues to be absolutely central. Obviously, a key area of struggle is the trade unions. A key area of struggle is organizing workers to resist in ways and forms that correspond to the needs of the situation. And if we look at recent developments in the CLC, we can see how far away we are from that situation. You have a president who unilaterally decides to endorse Liberal finance minister just recently, Bill Morneau, for a position with the OECD. An act of political rottenness at so many levels that it's hard to actually comprehend it. And yet clearly, if the CLC president is broken out of the stall, albeit that he wants a place in the Senate and whatever else, if he's broken out of the stall and is acting in that way, that's an indication of a rot that is very much deeper than his personal aberrant behavior. There is going to have to be a movement of rank and file organization and resistance on an enormous scale to break that kind of entrenched bureaucracy. So we also, I think, need to find ways in which we intervene in movements that give us the possibility of politically generalizing the forward movement. We've recently seen the Corbyn experience in the UK, for example. I don't see a corresponding development within the NDP, but that by no means automatically means that it isn't going to happen. We have to be attuned to those possibilities. We have to intervene in them at every point. And I think what is opening up for us is a remarkable period in which ideas of revolutionary socialism are no longer ideas that occupy necessarily the political fringe. I think this is a period in which bold, transformative ideas, notions of a society that is fundamentally different to this one, it corresponds to the needs and the thinking of people potentially on a truly mass scale. All my political life, I've been used to the idea of advancing ideas of revolutionary socialism as a minority, as someone who recognized that the great majority of working class people didn't see it that way. I think we have a real chance of changing that situation. I think we have a real chance of building revolutionary organization on a huge scale. And I don't think it is some nice option. I think it's a matter of vital historical necessity with an urgency and with a need in an livid way that it hasn't ever been before in our lives. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Our next speaker is Lisa Leuenberg. She's a prominent refugee rights activist and socialist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She lives near the spot where George Floyd was murdered by police, the event that sparked mass protests worldwide against racism and police brutality. Lisa is a member of the National Committee of Socialist Action USA. Welcome, Lisa.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I just want to start out by thanking SA Canada for inviting me here today to speak to you all. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments after the presentation. So this year in 2020, we've all been witness to one of the most astounding chain of events in modern history. We're truly living at a crucial turning point in history as we stagger from tragedy to tragedy as capitalism teeters on the edge of collapse. Of course, the major headlines around the world continue to focus on the global coronavirus pandemic. The US, while the richest nation in the world, has had some of the highest infection rates and death rates. COVID-19 deaths have now surpassed 200,000, a number that was unthinkable just a few short months ago, and we're on track to double that amount by the end of the year. Across the board, it has been Blacks, Asians, Latinx, Native Americans, immigrants, women, LGBTQI, and other oppressed groups that have suffered the most under the pandemic. People of color and other oppressed groups are more likely to work in frontline or so-called essential jobs. They're less likely to have access to healthcare. The racist underpinnings of the US system have been exposed by the effects of the pandemic on people of color. It's no coincidence that Blacks and other minorities are dying at much higher rates than their white counterparts. According to the COVID tracking project, Black people are dying at over two times the rate of white people nationwide. And Blacks and Native Americans and immigrants are also much more likely to be caught up in the prison and detention system, where the coronavirus pandemic has raged largely unchecked, leading to massive outbreaks. Women have also been largely impacted by the pandemic. In every instance, women, especially Black, Latina, Asian, Native American, lesbian, and trans women stand at the bottom of every measure of a decent life. Women make up 2/3 of those employed in the 40 lowest paid jobs, with women of color making up the majority of low paid workers. All the gains women have made in the labor market since the 1970s are being stripped away by the current crisis. Between February and May this year, 11 million jobs held by women disappeared. All the pain, rage, and misery that the working class has been experiencing for months boiled into the streets following the brutal police murder of George Floyd in broad daylight on a street corner in Minneapolis. In the days following his murder, "I Can't Breathe" became a rallying cry for the movement as widespread protests and riots erupted first in Minneapolis and then spread across the country and around the world. Millions of people fed up with lost wages and lack of access to healthcare, poured in the streets to protest the pandemic of police brutality and systemic racism. I live about 4 blocks from the 3rd Precinct police station in Minneapolis, and I will never forget the sound of tear gas canisters being fired into the crowd before the police station was stormed. The helicopters constantly flying over my home, the smoke and ashes hanging in the air as my neighborhood burned, and rage and hurt I felt in my community. Despite the mass protests of millions of people for weeks on end, the problem of police brutality and systemic racism has not been conquered. While the Minneapolis City Council debated defunding the police, they were allowing hundreds of homeless people to be evicted from city parks, their tents and belongings bulldozed if they refused to leave. While millions of protesters, Black, brown, and white, young and old, fought for justice in the streets, stormed the White House, and toppled Confederate statues, riot police and National Guard members clashed with peaceful protesters, and Breonna Taylor's murderer went free. And although the widespread protests raised the collective consciousness of the working class and exposed to the world the horrible racism inherent in the capitalist system, they have not brought about lasting change. Police continue to engage in racial profiling, and they continue to murder Black and brown people every day with virtual impunity. While protests rage in the streets, fires raged in California and much of the West Coast. As of today, over 4 million acres have been burned, making this the largest wildfire season in modern history. In California, they're paying thousands of incarcerated people between $2 and $5 a day that are being sent to fight these wildfires. And at the same time, we're hearing daily reports of melting ice, rising temperatures, and impending climate catastrophe. But despite ongoing protests, there's little to be being done to address climate change. And on top of it all, we just lived through a truly epic presidential election with the racist, homophobic, warmongering, misogynist Trump facing off against the lackluster Democratic pick Joe Biden. The 2020 election truly became a spectacle of lesser evilism. Much of the spontaneous, creative, and independent organizing and protesting that had been happening in the streets up until a few months ago was suddenly being sucked into get out the vote efforts. We often say that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements, and we truly saw this happen during the election cycle. Anyone but Trump became a mantra of many who were willing to vote for Biden or anyone else just to get Trump out of office. So we're safe now, right? The 4 horrible years of Trump are over. Now that Biden has been elected, things will go back to normal. He's going to save the economy, get us a COVID-19 vaccine, pass immigration reform, and address climate change. Policing will be reformed, bad cops will go to jail, and we'll have Medicare for all, right? Well, think again. Biden doesn't represent the working class any more than Trump does. He's just another rich, white, privileged, heterosexual man given a position of power by the ruling class. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party don't have the interests of the working people at heart. They're just two sides of the same coin. But replacing Trump with Biden will no more solve the problems of the capitalist system than will jailing a few so-called bad cops solve the problem of systemic racism. So if Biden isn't going to save us, if elections and voting aren't the answer, what is? How do we act on our anger and hope? How do we bring about a new society, one built on solidarity and collaboration, one that puts people before profit and the health of the planet before economic expansion? And didn't Socialist Action also participate in the election, you might ask? Well, yes, we did, but not because we had any illusion that we would win or influence the outcome. No, we participated because the election gave us a platform to share our views, another way to reach the hearts and minds of all the people, young and old, who are waking up and realizing they don't want to live another day under capitalism. Socialist Action is much more than a theorizing group of armchair socialists. We want to raise the consciousness of the working class, help people understand that the only way to win against racism, sexism, misery, climate change, all of it, is to break the capitalist system. And the only way we can do that is by organizing in the streets, being there in solidarity with working people. We must fight to build a revolutionary working class party that's independent of the Democrats, Republicans, and any connections to the ruling class. Socialist Action and our predecessors in the Socialist Workers' Party have a long history of leading and organizing social struggles. One of my favorite examples to draw from is the 1934 Teamsters strike led by a handful of comrades in Minneapolis throughout a bitter year. Despite being threatened, battling strikebreakers in the streets, and even being gunned down by police, the strikers led the movement to victory, making Minneapolis a union town and laying the groundwork for important labor struggles across the US. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend Farrell Dobbs' firsthand account of the strike Teamsters Rebellion. Since that time, our party has been involved in every major struggle and movement, including the civil rights movement, anti-war movement, the movements in solidarity with Cuba and Latin America, the feminist movement, climate justice, immigrant rights, and many more. All right. Okay, so today the health pandemic and the epidemic of police brutality have exposed the corruption of the capitalist system in new ways every day. We've already seen how the consciousness of working class people has risen to a new level as the lies of the ruling class have been exposed. Over the last few months, people have risked their lives to march and protest in the midst of the worst pandemic in 100 years. But despite the mass character of many of the protests we saw this year, they were largely spontaneous. They lacked a national leadership, a cohesion, a clear strategy that can make a movement sustainable. Many of the social movements being organized today lack a charismatic leader or group that can hold a movement together and provide national direction and leadership. This is true across many movements. There's no Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, no Cesar Chavez to lead today's movement. In the past, the union was able to provide leadership, but the labor movement has become weak after years of attacks and encroaching bureaucratization. The same holds true with many social movements. The best leaders and organizations people have to look to today are more often than not watered down by ties to the Democratic Party. So how do we go about building a truly independent movement of working people? I'm going to quote from a speech that was first given by Young Socialist Alliance leader Peter Camejo in 1969 called How to Make a Revolution. He says, "Revolutionary socialists have been accused for many years of wanting to throw the US government by force and violence. When they accuse us of this, what they are really trying to do is imply that we want to abolish capitalism with a minority, that we want to force the will of the minority on the majority. The opposite is the truth. We believe we can win a majority of people in the country to support a change in the system. It will be necessary to make a revolution precisely because the ruling powers will not peacefully accept a majority rule, which wants a basic change." Peter goes on to explain that the small number of ruling elite who run our country, let's say 30,000 people, hold sway over the rest of the 300 million of us by maintaining illusions. They want people to feel safe, secure, to put their hopes in a Democratic candidate like Joe Biden rather than in an independent social movement. The real danger to the ruling class comes when the masses of people begin to awake like they are now, when they see through the lies and illusions to the true nature of the beast, and they take matters into their own hands and start to realize their collective power. And while the ruling class will use force if necessary to suppress opposition, they will also try to keep their repression within the bounds of what they can get away with, without destroying the illusions they have so carefully created and waking up masses of people. That's why you didn't see the National Guard indiscriminately gunning down protesters after George Floyd's murder. Peter goes on to explain, now let me explain something about mass awakening. There's no way that we radicals can by ourselves wake up the American people. Just forget about that. There's no special leaflet we could write so articulately and carefully that when you hand it to a worker, he'll pick it up and say, "That's it, I'm with you." If that were how we could do it, we'd have done it a long time ago. There's only one way it will happen. Capitalism does it for us. The system creates the situation in which people wake up. So all of a sudden you have an increase in consciousness and awareness about the problems of society created by capitalists. And this awareness can become much more intensified if you have a crisis, if you have a major war or a downturn in the economic situation. Now you can have all this spontaneous radicalization. You can even have uprisings of sorts, but that will never result in a change in the system unless it's organized, unless there's a concept of how to struggle. Because the masses of people, when they first radicalize, they don't understand the general problems. They don't understand how to change society. Very few individuals come to this consciousness completely on their own. Think about the ideas, some of them very complex ideas, which have been a byproduct of the accumulation of thought and experience over the long history of revolutionary struggle. It's this thought, this experience, which is embodied in what we call the vanguard, organizations like the Young Socialist Alliance and the Socialist Workers' Party. Today, these ideas are embodied in socialist action. There's no shortcut to revolution. The path to revolution is a long and at times weary road. What we need to work towards is mobilizing people, winning them over to our ideas, and involving them in the struggle through mass movements. The US, Canada, and every other country in the world is made up of working class people. Blacks, Latinx, Native Americans, Asians, women, LGBTQI people, and every group make up an overwhelming mass of people who have no objective interest in the capitalist system. They have to be won over to our ideas and our strategy. We don't create the conditions for revolution, but we can create the subjective factor, the vanguard party. Our task is to build the revolutionary party, understand and participate in the revolutionary process, to be in the streets and now to be online too, with the working class, shoulder to shoulder with the best activists who are building movements to fight every kind of injustice inherent in the capitalist system. I want to invite everyone listening tonight to join Socialist Action, to join us in our ongoing work to make a new world possible.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, our next speaker is Julius Arscott. He was first elected to the Executive Board of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union in 2017. He is now an alternate member for the Toronto region. Julius is Vice President of OPSU Local 532 and is on the steering committee of the Workers' Action Movement and the NDP Socialist Caucus. He is a leading member of Socialist Action Canada. Welcome, Julius.
Thank you, comrade, and thanks to the other speakers. Fantastic talks. The first panel today described the multiple and deepening crises of the capitalist system. Capitalism, as Marx described, must constantly expand. Capitalists must make profit or perish. This is not driven by human need. It is driven by the imperatives of a system that now blocks the path to human progress, to the very survival of humanity. Capitalism has nothing to contribute, nothing positive. The tendency of the rate of profit to decline as global corporations adapt to every initiative of their competitors propels several processes. The speed up of production, as we see it at Amazon. This predatory behemoth manages order pickers and delivery drivers with continual remote time measurement and slave driver oversight. Automation, leading to unemployment of many instead of delivering benefits to all. Export of jobs to foreign shores and the abuse of super exploited labor. Racism, which increases profit. Sexism, which increases profit. Overshadowing all of these are deadly pandemics, austerity and concessions bargaining, endless war, and climate catastrophe. Capitalism can solve none of these problems. Not a single one. The revolutionary overthrow of capitalism by the assertion of workers' power, the destruction of the entire capitalist property system and state structure are the only practical and reasonable answers. Liberals, Stalinists, and Social Democrats say we revolutionaries are extremists and unreasonable people. It is not us, but the ravages of capitalism that are extreme, threatening survival of humanity and many other species. Their modest reforms solve nothing. In fact, over the past 50 years, neoliberal austerity has wiped out many reforms won earlier. Under reformist leadership, the workers' movement has been driven backwards. The working class is the only force with its hands on the great economic levers of society. Only the workers can bring the capitalist system of exploitation to a grinding halt. Only workers can start up the economy again under their own democratic control, no longer driven by profit, but by human needs. The bosses are completely unnecessary. What compels the working class to revolt? What ushers in a pre-revolutionary situation? It is not the brilliant pamphlets or sparkling oratory of revolutionary socialists, as Lisa described, though they can sometimes be brilliant and sparkling. It is not a relentless, increasing attack by capitalism on workers' standards of living, on workers' rights, on Black workers, women workers, and LGBTQI workers. A workers' revolt occurs when conditions become impossible and workers see no other way out. When that time comes, when a revolutionary opportunity appears, whether the revolution succeeds or fails will very much depend on whether there is a Leninist party sufficiently developed and with enough influence in the workers' movement to be able to emerge as the leadership. The Russian Revolution of October 1917 demonstrated conclusively that the victory of the Leninist concept of the Revolutionary Vanguard Party and the defeat of the Menshevik notion of the broad Marxist Party, the Mensheviks held that the working class spontaneously develops towards revolutionary consciousness, and that therefore the task of Marxists is to organize a party that would reflect this expectation. By relying on spontaneous militancy for the development of revolutionary consciousness, the Mensheviks relegated the historic tasks of the revolutionary vanguard to a spontaneous historical process. Inevitably, they built a mass party of uneducated workers led by a layer of careerists, parliamentarians, intellectuals for whom workers' power was remote and surreal. Such parties eventually and inevitably betrayed the socialist revolution. The Marxists or the Mensheviks supported Kerensky and the fleeting bourgeois government, the Duma, or parliament. Today, the NDP leadership sits atop a party founded by the merger of the Canadian Labour Congress and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. It is absolutely committed to Canadian imperialism. It is an implacable enemy of socialist revolution and the Revolutionary Party. This is what Menshevism has produced. This is what we must defeat in Canada to emerge as the leaders of the working class. We in Socialist Action fight the labor lieutenants of capital in tandem with like-minded activists and socialists and the NDP Socialist Caucus and the Workers' Action Movement. There's no way to avoid the fight. There's no easy way to win it. Those who do not understand the primacy of the working class, or who do not have the patience and grit for such a fight against social democratic treachery, will not make it as Leninist revolutionaries. Lenin held that revolutionary consciousness did not develop spontaneously, but had to be constantly fought for. He set out to build a disciplined vanguard party capable of fighting for the Marxist program, transforming the revolutionary potential of spontaneous militancy into revolutionary consciousness and revolutionary action. On a smaller scale, those who have organized workers prior to a collective agreement ratification vote know about the effort involved in educating and agitating to effectively fight the boss. None of this organization occurs spontaneously. Why is it that workers do not arrive at revolutionary class consciousness spontaneously? It's no mystery. Workers are educated in bourgeois schools, which falsely teach the superiority of capitalism, that insists that striving for personal profit is natural and normal. Workers work long hours to feed their families, pay rents, and pay down mortgages and credit card debt. They read or watch bourgeois media, which calls those who struggle against exploitation and oppression troublemakers, terrorists, or often racist names. Police violence is always just behind the curtain, or it is blatant and omnipresent for racial, gender, and sexual minorities. And most workers are fragmented, lacking union representation. Unionized workers are seldom mobilized by the privileged pro-capitalist bureaucrats who dominate the unions and who run them autocratically. The working class develops towards political class consciousness through mass action in the class struggle and through the resulting clash of rival leaderships, political parties, and programs. Revolutionary consciousness can develop only by means of the dialectic between theory and practice, formulated in a program and developed consistently only by a revolutionary party. The task of the Revolutionary Party is to win the majority of the working class to the revolutionary banner by means of the fight for a program of transitional and democratic demands. Our job is to transform the revolutionary potential of spontaneous militancy into revolutionary communist consciousness and to develop and to defeat all middle-class contenders active in the workers' movement. How important is our work? Trotsky summed up the centrality of the Revolutionary Party in a famous expression: the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. The gathering multifaceted crisis of world capitalism is forcing the working class, one layer after another, onto the streets in opposition, beginning with super exploited and specially oppressed people, Blacks and other racialized minorities, women, and workers from underdeveloped countries. With the passage of time, the reformists' desperate efforts to hold back the wheel of history will demonstrate more clearly to the masses that the crisis of proletarian leadership, having become the crisis of humanity, can be resolved only by revolutionary socialist leadership. The bourgeoisie intervenes purposefully in this process. The bourgeoisie creates a labor aristocracy and promotes the growth of a parasitic labor bureaucracy within the workers' movement. This alien intrusion into the working class creates the main obstacle to the development of class consciousness and the principal enemy of communism. The reformist bureaucracy fosters reformist illusions on the working class and maintains reformism in the workers' movement by means of opposition to militant action and by relentless war on the communists. We who participate in the workers' action movement have firsthand experience with this. The fear and paranoia and reactionary behavior of the misleaders of our unions are a result of our relentless agitational, educational, and organizational work. WAM candidates received massive support, 36 and 34% of the votes of delegates at the November 2019 convention of the Ontario Federation of Labour, which the OFL brass refused to acknowledge. The program and practice of the labor bureaucracy limit the forward motion of the masses. Development towards class consciousness can occur only as a result of political struggle between the tendencies active in the workers' movement. Now, the working class in general, and the advanced workers in particular, mature through political conflict. The development of the working class towards class consciousness can only take the form of the political struggle of tendencies and parties. A key mechanism to move the workers' movement forward and to clarify the political differences between the various tendencies in the workers' movement is the united front tactic. We call for all forces who agree with limited, specific democratic and transitional demands to form a united front to advance those specific demands for the benefit of all workers. To be effective, a united front must be non-exclusionary. It must operate democratically, and it must allow all tendencies to promote their own programs and to speak freely. We pursue this tactic in all of the work that we do. And it is evident most recently in the Toronto May Day Committee, and our Venezuela, Cuba, and Palestine solidarity work, and our Appeal Against Racism rally, and the international campaign to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, and in our current proposal for united socialist campaigns in the next municipal elections, to name just a few examples. The Revolutionary Party is not an intellectual's parlor game. It is a workers' organization. It is the product of a series of sharp, conscious struggles, not only against the ruling class, but against reformism and ultra-leftism inside the working class. We move from tendency and faction fights in the ranks of the revolutionary organization to mergers with other parties that are moving in a revolutionary direction and splits with those moving in the opposite direction. The development of the Revolutionary Party is a highly conscious process. It is the exact opposite of spontaneous. And it is the only way to save the human race from the misery and the threat of extinction. As we say, the work is its own reward, and this way forward is indispensable. Join Socialist Action. Together, we will win, and the sooner, the better. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so now what we are going to do is turn it over to Kurt Young, our producer, and he will read and put questions in the chat column for our panelists. He will put up 3 questions, and then the panelists will speak to them in this order. First it will be Lisa, then Julius, then Radhika, then John. And you have 5 minutes to answer the questions, up to 5 minutes, and please strict 5 minutes. So, Kurt, first 3 questions.
So we have a total of 12 questions for the 3 rounds. So I was thinking that we could have 4 questions asked.
Oh, okay, sure, Kurt, that sounds right.
Okay.
Go ahead. And they have up to 5 minutes.
Give me one moment. So the first question comes from Rosemary. She asks, do reforms equal transitional demands as Trustee saw them? Ellen Ramsey asks, is the concept of the contradiction between the forces and relations of production by Marx still relevant? Barry Weisletter asks, while socialists argue for state intervention to begin to meet human needs rather than rely on the non-free market, isn't there a profound difference between intervention by a bourgeois state, often a authoritarian state like Russia, China, and Turkey, on the one hand, and the worker state that organizes economic output for workers' self-emancipation to improve the quality of life? And Robert McDermott asks, could you name some of the main Marxist economists? I would think of David Harvey, who is really popular monthly reviews under consumptionism. As a follow-up, could you explain overproduction versus underconsumptionism?
Okay, so you've heard or read the 4 questions, and you have up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, 3, or you can pass if you wish. And the first speaker is on the panelist is Lisa.
All right, I have to unmute myself there. Well, I'm gonna leave some of the more theoretical type questions to maybe some of the other speakers, but I will just say a few comments on transitional demands, because I think that's an important question. Like, why do we use transitional demands? And I think the purpose of transitional demands is really to be in touch with like the working class and working people, and you know, what's getting at the heart of the struggles that are going on right now, and thinking about like what is going to connect with the workers when we're out in the streets, and then also how can we push those movements forward also. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I've been a part of many United Front type coalitions, like Julius was talking about, which is something that we try to participate in a lot as Socialist Action. And so I think this question of transitional demands can really, really be an important and a difficult question, especially when you're working with a lot of other groups that might have a different point of view than we do. It can be very important to really think through, like, how are we connecting to the working class, and how are we pushing this movement forward, and make, you know, radicalizing people. How are our demands going to kind of raise that consciousness, cause people to think, and you know, we really need to be out there in the streets, even though it's difficult right now with a pandemic. We've been doing a lot more different types of creative organizing, like these webinars and being online. So it's about thinking outside of the box and really just trying to be involved in as many movements as we can, so that we really have our finger on the pulse of the movements that are out there and what working people are thinking of and what's important to them today. I will pass it on to someone else.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Okay, our next is Julius. Comrade Julius.
Okay, yeah, well, great questions, and some of them I have some thoughts on, and others I'm not sure. Just to continue with what Lisa was saying, I mean, I think one of the main differences, I mean, we support, reforms are important, and Radhika actually touched on this quite a bit, saying that Marxists should support reforms, and we do support reforms. The winning of reforms empowers the working class. It empowers workers to reach beyond what they think is possible. Transitional demands, more specifically though, while we support reforms, transitional demands are demands which we use almost as an agitational tool to make a demand that capitalism essentially cannot support, or they're demands that create that wedge, the thin edge of the wedge that basically shows the inherent contradictions of capitalism. So those are some of the key things that we argue for. And I mean, I think that, for instance, a transitional demand that's very popular right now would be the abolition of the police. So is that going to happen under capitalism? No, it's not going to. It's the police are the guards of wealth, of capital, and without them, the ruling class has no guards. So that's one example. Barry brought up an issue here of socialists argue for state intervention to begin to meet human needs rather than relying on the non-free market. Isn't there a profound difference between intervention by bourgeois states? And then he gave a few examples. I mean, I think it's interesting where you see, if you look at Cuba, for instance, Cuba has been able to deal with COVID remarkably, considering the embargo from the United States. But even, Cuba regularly deals with natural disasters. They're right in the path of hurricanes on a regular basis, and yet they're able to mobilize their population in a way that, frankly, the United States can't do. And I think, it kind of brings me back to the last session when Bryn brought up the discussion of how American and Canadian and some Western economies have responded to COVID with the delay and asking people to wear masks. And his idea that could be because in many third world countries or poor nations where all of these things are produced, it's in some ways it's easier for them to transition over to produce for human needs for something as simple as a mask, as opposed to a state like the United States, which, while it is the most powerful nation on earth, can't do that. It doesn't have the capacity to do that because it's outsourced all of those facilities, and frankly, the capitalist class in the United States is not interested in such a venture. It's the same as here in Canada. I mean, we argued for nationalization or public ownership of the GM plant in Oshawa, and many people were doing that at the beginning of the pandemic to produce defibrillators and other medical equipment that we may need for the pandemic. And Robert asked to mention some main Marxist economists. The only other name that I can think of is Ernest Mandel, who I know, Rob, you're familiar with. The name David Harvey was mentioned here. While he is popular, I believe that at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening in the United States, and he actually was quite negative with the idea of pursuing socialist revolution. So a lot of academic Marxists, when it comes down to it, are not actual real proponents of revolution. They just like to talk about it.
30 seconds.
I think I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Radhika?
Okay, quickly, to Rosemary's question, I would say the short answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that they are stepping stones to revolution, but no, in an important sense. I think, I don't know whether this has to do with what Trustee really said or how he's interpreted, but I think that it's impossible to know whether a given demand is a transition, like, it's some sort of a mere reform, or whether it turns out to be revolutionary. Take Lenin's and the Bolsheviks' demands in the context of the Russian Revolution. They asked for peace, bread, and land. I mean, how modest could you get? But they were there. But in reality, they were pursuing, in order to get the adherence of the working class, you needed to offer them some concrete improvements in their situation. So whether a reform is revolutionary or not depends on the situation. If the ruling class cannot deliver, it becomes revolutionary. Or rather, if the ruling class cannot deliver and the working class is willing to take matters in its own hands and achieve it, then it becomes revolutionary. So that's my answer. Concept of contradiction, which, yes, I do think it's still relevant. Interestingly enough, I think that, for example, off the top of my head, I can say that, quite frankly, we're living in a time where the potential of information and communications technology would be much better realized if we had socially owned, publicly owned platforms rather than Facebook and Google and Amazon and what have you. I think that's one of the big things that is holding back the fuller development of these technologies is their capitalist organization. So, for example, I can tell you that payment systems in China are more developed. That leads me to Barry's question. So while I do agree with Barry that Russia and Turkey are capitalist, I would beg to differ that China is capitalist. That's a small point. The larger point is certainly true. Yes, it is true that when capitalists organize a state intervention, it is radically different, or capitalist states do so, is radically different from when socialist states do so. But, and this is a big but, and I've been writing a lot about this, Marx and Engels pointed out, and Marx is in a century or so living in the age of monopoly capitalism. When you get monopolies, they represent the vices of monopoly without any virtues of having a social organization of production. So in that sense, I would say, and Marx said, and others said, that actually the monopoly stage of capitalism is ripe for a transition to socialism. The difficulty is that the left has not been in a position to organize it, partly because of some of the things I said. So that's my short answer to your question. Perhaps I'm missing a few things, but I must carry on. What other Marxist economists I can think of? Basically, there are a lot. And David Harvey, by the way, is actually a Marxist geographer. He's not a Marxist economist, and I doubt he understands even much of Marxist economics. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can, those are the ones I could think of immediately. I don't want to tar people with a wrong brush. Oh, and by the way, Mandel, although he used Marx, he was a much more faithful follower of Marx. I will wrap up here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to admit I don't have access to the chat, and I was a little bit distracted by something when the questions were being asked, so I didn't actually get a very good breakdown of the actual questions, but I'm going to just jump in and improvise. And I think the key one I too want to focus on is the question of transitional demands, which I think are really take on a particular significance. The question of what precisely constitutes a transitional demand, obviously the idea is that it lends itself to the concept of transition, of social transition. It's a demand that you place before the ruling class or the state that advances the struggle beyond ability or willingness of the state to meet those demands. And I mean, the way Trotsky puts it in the transitional program is that essentially, if this system is unable to meet such a demand, then let it perish. And that the realizability or unrealizability of the demand will be decided by the balance of forces. And that kind of bold demand, it seems to me, has particular relevance at this time, because we are dealing with such a multifaceted and profound crisis that is imposing so much hardship and so limits the lives of people, that to advance demands that are not based on what you think the government is likely to give this week, but is based actually on actually based on the needs of communities. I mean, I agree in that sense that you can't imagine under capitalism them actually agreeing to abolish the police. But at the same time, nor can Black communities in the United States, racialized communities in many countries, endure the brutality and racism that they face at the hands of the police. So the demand in that sense is thoroughly realistic, because it meets the needs of people and speaks to the needs of people in a way that's so important and so profound. So I think the transitional method is something that is really coming to new life in this situation of enormous crisis. And I just finally say, with regards to economists, I think we need to focus on, at the moment, the most important thing is to look at those who are actually doing the analysis of this crisis. And there are two that I've found particularly helpful in that regard. One has been the British Marxist economist Michael Roberts, who's done incredible stuff around the rate of profit in the crisis, and correspondingly Geoffrey McCormack here in Canada, who's done similar work about the nature of the crisis that's unfolding and the state of Canadian capitalism in this period of crisis.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt, our producer, for 4 more questions. And then the lineup, the panel will be Julius, Radhika, John, and Lisa. And you will have up to 5 minutes. Kurt?
All right, so
read them slow for John.
all right. So our first question comes from Yvonne Hansen. How can Americans and Canadians work together outside of electoral politics to drive revolutions in our respective countries? The second question comes from Mark Lister. The 1919 Winnipeg general strike occurred during the Spanish flu pandemic. What lesson can we learn from the strike that might be applicable to a general strike now? John Ord asks, how do you square the declining rate of profit theory with the historically massive profits in the last 2 decades of Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and many others? Dustin Brown asks, some tenant organizers have publicly called on OPSU to prevent mass evictions by refusing to participate in eviction hearings. Has OPSU responded to this request? Who among OPSU can help?
Okay, thank you, Kurt. You've heard and read the questions, so we will now go to Julius. You have up to 5 minutes. Unmute yourself.
Geez, I did it. Okay, all right, thanks. Great questions. I'm going to start with the last one from Dustin. So yes, what has OPSU done, and what can it do to help tenant organizations? So OPSU is the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. They represent some of the sheriffs who go into some of these situations and basically assist in evicting tenants from their homes. I think OPSU, as far as I know, centrally has not really done anything, which unfortunately is not a surprise. On a more regional level, there has been some outreach done, from what I understand, in terms of assisting some of these organizations, trying to get them reach out to locals where those workers are organized. And there certainly are things that can be done, and I don't know the details as to what's happening there, because it's not in my workplace. And although I am an alternate executive board member, I'm not working on this on a day-to-day basis. But For instance, within my local, we had the landlord-tenant board working. They were part of my local 532. They're not anymore. They were the courts. And a few years ago, we were in contact with one of these tenant organizations, and we worked together and strategized with the stewards in that location to basically shut down the workplace because of health and safety concerns. So there's different ways you can deal with it. There was basically it was an occupation that took place, and that's where the argument for the health and safety concerns could have come from. You could be more bold than that, you know. You can be much more bold than that and get the local or the union to basically come out and say, we will not administer these evictions if they're due to COVID. But that takes a real push from the membership. Is that being facilitated? I hope so. I hope the discussion between the tenants organizations and those workers are taking place. Certainly it's not an end deal. There's still lots of time, as John had mentioned. Many people, thousands of people are going to be put into a position of possibly being evicted, and those workers, those OPSU members, are going to be front line of those situations. And from what I've heard, they're not happy with that situation. Will they organize around it? Certainly, if they do, they need our support, all of our support. Yvonne asked how Americans and Canadians can work together outside of electoral politics to drive the revolutions in our respective countries. I mean, I think there's a lot of crossover and on issues such as Black Lives Matter.
Is Julia still there? Right. Julia seems to
So
be...
maybe we can move on to Radhika, Kurt.
Okay.
So we get back to Julius. Radhika?
Okay, sure. I'll just take a couple of these. And so, I mean, I guess I can simply say that it's trying to square the declining rate of profit with the historically massive profits that are being made by Amazon, Apple, etc. I would say, yes, of course, while there can be a general declining rate of profit, there can always be some some sectors of capitalist industry that can increase their profits. The point is that the average rate of profit goes down. And what is the best sign that the average rate of profit is going down is that most companies are not investing productively, but rather are sitting on vast hoards of cash on which they are seeking returns, which is driving the financialization, or which is an important aspect of what is driving the financialization of our economies. So that's one thing. Secondly, how can Americans, Canadians, and others work together outside politics to drive revolutions? I would say, obviously, I think that they must organize at the local level, but then also connect those organizations to larger party-like formulations, whether they take part in electoral politics or not, but they have a broader perspective on what will happen. But I think the most important thing is, to me, that they must create relations of solidarity beyond their societies to other movements, and in some cases there will also be governments that are going to be supportive of revolution. We are speaking at this point, this year is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Friedrich Engels, and Friedrich Engels is often underestimated, but he was a very important ally, obviously a partner of Marx, and he made many contributions of his own, and one of them was to think about how revolutions are going to take place. And one conclusion he came to is that the armed might of the state, already before he passed away, had already become too great for workers to overwhelm the capitalist state on their own. And that clearly implies that at some point, and this is something I'm working on right now, but at some point, what Engels was there for, what the implication is that the struggle becomes international. It becomes a struggle between states where things are further ahead, where society has been more revolutionized, and allying with other movements in states that are less advanced in this respect.
Okay, John?
Here you.
You're muted, John.
You're muted, John.
Oh, sorry. So sorry. I
That's
vowed
okay.
I wouldn't do that, and I ended up doing it. So I'm going to focus on, take the lead of focusing on the final question around OPSEU and evictions, because I think it's an incredibly important practical question. And I'd like to give an example actually taken from CUPE, from the municipal union. When I was involved with the union, when I was involved with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, we were organising to get access for people on social assistance to a benefit called the Special Diet. So it was a discretionary benefit that they had to get a medical provider sign up for it, and they were to a huge degree blocked by the bureaucracies. So at one particular social assistance office, the staff there, the workers there, were very supportive of management in preventing people getting access to it. There was a lot of racism, quite frankly, in the way people were treated. There was another office where there was a shop steward who really gave a lead, who got the workers together and said, look, this is a medical decision been taken by a doctor. I don't have any medical qualifications, nor do you. If management wants to try to stop this, that's up to them. But I am going to, if a doctor tells me somebody has certain conditions and is entitled to a benefit, I'm going to put it through, and then management can deal with it if they don't like it. And that was done. And that made an enormous difference to how people were treated and access to that benefit. A really practical but important question. Now we're talking about something where we're asking workers who are part of a government system that is working on eviction to disrupt and to defy. That's a really bold step. There's not going to be too many union leaders pushing for that. But if there's a real link made with workers, rank and file workers, leaders, good militant stewards and such like, the possibilities of doing something really bold that's really going to make an enormous contribution to gumming up the works of this eviction factory has incredible possibilities. And those are exactly the kind of interventions that revolutionaries need to make. Those are exactly the kind of interventions where people need to get in there and give a lead and draw important lessons. And you know, I mean, there's real possibilities there. So really something really exciting, I think. I'm very sorry to also say I'm being warned that my battery is about to run out. So if you lose me, I do apologize, but I'll hold on as long as I can.
Okay, thank you, John. Lisa?
All right. Well, I'll start briefly with the question about Canadians and Americans working together. Obviously, that's a very important question, and you know that's why I'm here tonight. Obviously, I think one of the most important things that socialists can do is make sure that the movements we're building are international. So, you know, even though we have differences in the system and the struggles that we're building in different countries, obviously we have lots and lots of overlap and things in common with the working class in Canada and many, many other countries around the world. So it's just very important to reach out, to talk to each other, to collaborate, to follow what's going on in different countries, and then as much as possible to, you know, build movements that are in solidarity. So if there's a movement in Canada, you know, that's very close to us, or same goes for them, you know, building solidarity with movements in the United States, and as much as we can, building those movements together and keeping each other informed. I also wanted to speak to the question around evictions. This is a very, very crucial question for the United States right now. There are currently about 30 to 40 million people, which includes renters and homeowners, who are at risk of losing their housing right now because of COVID. So, right now we have eviction protections in place, but this is, there's a lot of landlords who are doing everything they can to get around those, and they're intimidating people and threatening people. And this is poised to become, I think, just a crucial question and movement. So I think there's a lot that we can draw on from other movements that are happening. Just a few things that are happening here in Minneapolis, where I live. There's a lot of homeless people who live on the streets. Our shelters are maxed out, so it's especially difficult during the winter because there are people living in tents. And there's been a big battle over with the park board because people have been living in tents in the park, and then they limited the number of people who are able to do that. And so they've been evicting people from parks, but they have nowhere else to go. So there's been a movement around that. That's just, it's just people who live in the neighborhoods or homeless people themselves who are leading these movements. And there's been efforts to get them into hotels that are safe, where they can also be quarantined. There was even for a while a group that took over a hotel and brought people who are homeless in there. And then there's also another important movement here in Minneapolis called Defend Glendale. And Socialist Action, we've worked with them in the past. It's a movement that is fighting the privatization of public housing here in Minneapolis. And they've been fighting that for, I would say, 6 or 7 years, maybe. And it's a movement that's largely led by immigrants, like Somali immigrants or other immigrants, because they use the public housing system, and that's being bought out by private owners. It's been in the process of doing that for a long time. So fighting that. So I think that getting involved in these movements around evictions and housing is something that we need to really watch.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so because Julius had some technical problems, I'm going to go back to him for 2 minutes. Comrade Julius?
Sure, I hope that the connection's a little bit better now. Yeah, for the first question about international solidarity, I just want to echo what Lisa said. I think that the way forward with that is through campaign work. There are common issues that relate to both countries. Both Canada and the United States primarily speak English, so we get a lot of information on what's going on in the United States quite easily, and that's translated, for instance, into a lot of Black Lives Matter demonstrations that have taken place in major and smaller cities across Canada, in places that you would not have thought would have such a action, such as Cobourg and some of the smaller cities across country. I wanted to, again, focus on the issue of housing. I think John makes an excellent point that, there's real potential for workers to get involved in this fight. I mean, it needs to be tied into the fact that the people who are being evicted are also, there are family, there are neighbors, there are friends. It is a workers' issue. And for workers to be asked to be the people at the front line to kick these people out of their own homes is something that we really need to drive home. And that takes our organizing, and it takes radicals to be in the workplace, to talk to these people, to convince them and to talk to them, to hear them out as well, because I think that they're feeling this on the need for a kind of action that is not all too non-typical, unfortunately, in the workers' movement, and that is, work stoppages. That leads me to 30 seconds. Okay, the Winnipeg general strike. I would say the biggest lesson from that is the need for mass action. Labor needs to move again. There's no movement in labor, and there hasn't been for decades. We need that, and little and significant actions such as something around tenants' rights would go a long way at empowering workers in the labor movement, I think.
Okay, thank you, Julius. All right, we're going to go back for our last set of questions, and you will get up to 5 minutes again. And the lineup will be John, Lisa, Radhika, and Julius. So, Kurt?
Okay, so our first question comes from Asan Razvi. He asks, so how exactly do we go from ideas to results, change outcomes? How do we connect disparate voices on the left to create momentum for change? Ellen Ramsey asks, actually, let me, I might have messed up. Yeah, that's correct. John, or doesn't the declining rate of profit apply over time? These are relatively new businesses. Surely they will experience a decline in the rate of profit also. So it's a response to John Orr's question, but I believe it should also be a question posed to our panelists. Barry Wiseletter asks, how can the United Front tactic transform a revolutionary minority into a revolutionary majority? One capable of leading the working class to transform society. And Dustin Brown asks, how can revolutionary socialists work against marginal Marxism in their organizing efforts, especially in the early formation of new organizations?
Okay, John. Turn your mic on.
Sorry about it.
That's okay.
Just to stress around the rate of profit again, the decisive question in terms of the development of this crisis is indeed the average rate of profit. And so you can actually, and this work has been done, it's not a matter of conjecture, you can actually look at how profit within the capitalist system has gone, how the rates of profit have gone. You see the post-war years, the golden age of Keynesianism and all the rest of it with very high levels. Then you see a decline. Then you see a vicious attempt to restore the rate of profit precisely through a neoliberal agenda to intensify exploitation. And what's striking about that initiative is it took some time to work to the extent that it did. It took several years before it kicked in, but then rates of profit start to come up based on the reorganizing of the global workforce, the global supply chain, based on intensified exploitation, a whole series of things. But that period of expansion comes to an end with the Great Recession, and there has been this stagnant situation where investment is chronically low because rates of profit are chronically low at this point, and they are at this point tasked with trying to restore rates of profit. And that's why some of the implications of the period ahead are so brutal, because in this situation, to restore rates of profit where people have been where there's been so much economic dislocation is going to be a very, very brutal period. And let me just finally very quickly say, with regards to the use of the United Front tactic, the United Front tactic, I think, brings people together who have radical but disparate views and enables them to work in ways that are concretely cooperative and fruitful. And that's an enormous situation. And I don't think we can underestimate in the present period the possibilities when precisely that kind of lead is given to people who have had enough, people who are angry, people who are in turmoil, really, in terms of their thinking. So really major possibilities for really titanic struggles breaking out in the period ahead. And the United Front tactic, I think, is entirely the correct way to bring that together.
Okay. Thank you, comrade. Lisa?
All right, well, I'll start by just echoing that those comments on the United Front, because that's pretty much what I was going to say as well. The United Front is really about building the broadest movement possible and bringing the broadest number of people, the most people that to the streets and the getting
Okay. I think Lisa is having some technical problems.
Yeah, so we'll.
Okay, so we'll move on to Radhika. Oh, you're back, Lisa?
Hold on. Go.
Oh, could you not hear me?
No, not for the last 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, I was just saying how the United Front is really about bringing the broadest number of people together, the broadest number of groups to work together on common goals, which is very, very important right now. And then I wanted to briefly address the first question, which is how do we go from ideas to outcomes and results? How do we go from ideas to actions? And that's just one of the most important questions to me, because our group is called Socialist Action for a reason, right? We're not just these armchair theorists where we talk about things, but we also need to be out there in the streets organizing. So if you're not sure how to do that, I would say just start by jumping in, find an action in your local area that you can go to and go to it and start, maybe volunteer to do something to help that group build the next action. And I think that by doing that, you will find that there are many, many ways that we can apply theory to action. So everything that we're talking about and everything that Trotsky and Lenin and all those people that we read and Rosa, their ideas came from concrete action. It came from the Russian Revolution. And so we can take those ideas and apply them to things that are happening now. So I think that's the important takeaway.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Radhika?
Yeah, sure. I suppose this is the last time I'll speak, so I just wanted to say how much I've learned from my co-panelists. Thank you very much. Okay, so to dive into the question, ideas to actions, I concur with everything that Lisa was saying, and I would add just the following. I think historically, many Marxists have taken the wrong route to understanding this relationship. So I hear so many people talking about raising the consciousness of people and so on. I mean, this is very patronizing. I think Marx and Engels saw themselves, and I think we should see ourselves as essentially serving the ongoing struggles of people, whether they are for wages, against rents and evictions, or for migrant rights or what have you. There is a whole diversity against racism. There are a whole diversity of issues, and intellectuals have to put their ideas at the service, put their intellectual capacities at the service of these struggles, explicating the deeper causes of the problems people face, working out the implications of various policy options and strategic and tactical options, and so on. And I think this is what we need to do. Everything else is, these intellectuals need to do all the other work, but I think ultimately the purpose should be that. The second is declining rates of profit. I'm afraid when I was asked to enumerate Marxist economists, I should have mentioned Michael Roberts. I don't agree with Michael Roberts that profit rates have been restored. On the contrary, if you actually take, because people like Michael Roberts, they're only looking at manufacturing or Main Street companies. But in order to look at how much accumulated profit is looking for a return, you have to add to that financial companies. And if you add both of them, you will see that there is an enormous amount of money chasing the thinnest possible returns. And this is why the Federal Reserve and central banks generally have been pouring liquidity. Central banks of capitalist countries have been pouring liquidity into the market so that they can aid the leverage speculation of these companies so that they can make a profit. So this is what it's about. And I think there is a long-term falling rate of profit, and you can show that. My partner, Alan Freeman, has written a very, very important article on this, which shows the declining rate of profit, provided you factor in the financial companies. So that's the second question. United Front, etc. I mean, I would say that on this point, we really have a bit of a quandary right now, because as I think John, was it, or Julius, somebody pointed out that, our unions are behaving as essentially the representatives of what Lenin would have called a labor aristocracy. So really, we need to conceptualize the working class much more broadly as basically including everybody, whether they are employed or not, whether they work for an industrial corporation or not, but everybody who must work for a living. And if you think about it that way and think of uniting that entire class in a broad set of struggles and connecting their various struggles, as I say, against racism, in education, in housing, etc., etc. I think that's where we have to go. I'm not sure United Front is really a viable tactic anymore. And I think, and I should also add that the reason why we can have greater gains made by labor aristocracies is imperialism. So we have to remember that. And I think I'll end there. I don't quite understand what is meant by managerial Marxism. So I will simply end there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Julius.
Thank you. A lot of what I wanted to say has been said. I think the key to connecting with folks in different on different fronts in terms of equity or the environment or anti-imperialism work. The United Front, the benefit is working with other people who are like-minded and gaining confidence of our ideas, winning confidence with those people and winning over the best fighters from those movements to building a revolutionary party. It's very important to be engaged in the movements. As Lisa said, we're not armchair socialists. We're not a debate club, an endless debate club. We're out on the streets. We're in the union locals. We're in our electoral district associations. We're doing the grunt work. That's what we do. And that's where the workers are. That's where the fighters are. That's where the people who feel compelled enough to get out of their seats and onto the streets are. And those are the people that we want to work. So that's it starts small, but it's important work. And you'd be surprised. I became an executive board member of my union representing the Toronto region as a revolutionary socialist. My platform was a revolutionary socialist platform calling for, union democracy, stopping concessions bargaining, for Palestine solidarity, all of the things that careerists have been told never touch. And I won because workers want an alternative. Our candidates did so well at the convention based on our ideas and the work that we've done. So you gain confidence by working within the workers' movements and presenting our ideas there. And the more of us that there are in the workers' movements, the better. The more workers are going to hear our ideas. I'm not sure about the term managerial Marxism. I'm not sure what that refers to either, unfortunately. I know that there are a lot, what I would call sort of academic Marxists, folks who are kind of anti-Leninist, people who are not, they don't identify with building the need to build a revolutionary party. It's spontaneous Marxist. I think the way to deal with folks like that is for us to do what we need to do in building a revolutionary party and not hold back within the workers' movement, which a lot of these folks do, and they tell people to hold back, and we're not about that.
Okay, thank you, Julius. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our educational conference. And for now, I'm going to go back to Kurt, and we're going to once again hear the wonderful voice of Y.C. Lee as he performs the Internationale.
Arriba los pobres del mundo, de pie los esclavos sin pan, y gritemos todos unidos, viva la Internacional. Removamos todas las trabas que nos impiden nuestro bien. Cambiemos el mundo de base, hundiendo al imperio burgués. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final. Y se alcen los pueblos por la Internacional. agrupémonos todos en la lucha final y se alzan los pueblos comprador, es la internacional. Debout les damnés de la terre, debout les forçats de la faim, la raison tendant son cratère, c'est l'éruption de la fin. Du passé faisant table rase, vous les slaves debout, debout. Le monde va changer de base, nous ne sommes rien soyons. C'est la lutte finale, groupons-nous et demain l'international sera le genre humain. C'est la lutte finale, groupons-nous et demain l'international sera le genre humain. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth. For justice thunders condemnation, for a better world's in a birth. No more traditions change shall bind us. Arise, ye slaves, no more in thrall. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been not, we shall be all. 'Tis the final conflict, let each stand in its place. The international working class shall be the human race. 'Tis the final conflict, let each stand in its place. The international working class shall be the human race.
Wow. Thank you so much, YC. Are you there, Kurt? Aye, we're back. We're back. Okay, thank you so very much, YC. That was just wonderful. So this brings us to the conclusion, comrades and friends. Special thanks to all of our panelists for both sessions. It's Kathy, Tamara, Kostas, Bryn, Radhika, John, Lisa, and Julius. And of course to our producer, Kurt Young. And to everybody who participated in tonight's conversations. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper. It's only $27 for 1 year, delivered to your door. And to fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction. That's www.socialistaction.ca. And maybe you would like to, while you're there, read the statement of principles. Capitalism isn't working. Okay, and if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like this event, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Our next webcast is Thursday, November the 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's titled The Road to a Mass Eco-Socialist Party, with former British Labour Party activist Alan Freeman, past Manitoba NDP MLA Marianne Cirilli, and Socialist Action British Columbia organizer Gary Porter. For these details, just visit www.socialistaction.ca. And once again, thanks to everybody. And in the meantime, in between time, stay safe, stay healthy, be active. Bye for now.